Today, we're going to cover some of the caving and cave diving disasters that we have covered on this channel. Be sure to subscribe for more videos like this. Back in 1966, a group of young Boy Scouts ventured into the easily accessible Howard's Waterfall Cave. The troop used the fire of lanterns to guide their path as they trekked bravely into the darkness, not knowing the dark secrets this cave concealed. Their adventure turned disastrous when a sudden explosion blasted the cave apart. This is the story of the celebrated rescuers, the survivors, and the mourned losses of Howard's Waterfall Cave. Before we dive into the video, I want to take a moment to thank all of you who have subscribed to this channel. Our subscriber rate has grown from 8% to 13%, which is truly amazing. If you're new here, simply click the subscribe button, like this video, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. Now let's get into the video. The curiosity of Howard's Waterfall Cave. Trenton is a small town nestled in the northwestern corner of the state of Georgia. Trenton was originally dubbed Salem, Georgia, until a mining company came and renamed the town while gathering precious coal from the ground. The caves near Trenton, both natural and man-made, were used by both sides during the Civil War. Small towns caught in the crossfire would flee underground during battles, and some of these rocky havens, like the Smolin Cave in Missouri, were even used by Union spies to meet and share critical information. The town of Trenton is still stuck in its controversial past, and it's gained more infamy from the tragedies in its nearby caves. Trenton's rural lifestyle was the perfect place for a chapter of the Boy Scouts of America. The scouting organization reworked classic military training handbooks to teach kids the values of independence, leadership, and nature. Hiking and camping are the bread and butter of the Scouts. One day, a kid from the local chapter turned toward the sound of running water during a hike in the woods. He ventured off on his own and saw water splashing from the stone canopy of Howard's Waterfall Cave. He brought the rest of the group over to look, and they could tell that the darkness beneath the waterfall continued onward. He was eager to explore it right away, but the scout leader took command of the situation and sent the boys back toward their camp. Gossip spread as the boys imagined what secrets lay beneath the waterfall. The scout leader of the area thought it would be a great idea to take the troop down into the cave. He knew the cave was mostly open space with no real dangers for the first few hundred feet. They could easily explore down to the real challenging areas to teach the kids a lesson on the dangers of the cave, whilst also showing the wonders of the rocky depths. 27-year-old scout veteran Phil Howell would guide the group into the cave. The group departed to one of the 5 entrances of Howard's Waterfall Cave. There, they began their journey by leaving the roadside and hiking through the wilderness. The first 100 feet of the cave is a breeze, but then the group got to the first hazard, a 20-foot drop. Phil reminded the boys how to descend the rock, demonstrated the climb, and waited at the bottom in case anyone fell. They each got past the area with no problems. The next section was a sprawling maze that cavers easily got lost inside of. The scouts had a difficult time with the section since they didn't have modern equipment. There were few maps of the cave back then, and any gear they had was primitive at best. The boys were using carbide lamps that use active flames to light their path. These old-timey lamps could be worn on mining helmets or held in the hand. The flames cast dancing shadows across the smooth speleoforms around the cave, which made it difficult for the group to find the turn they needed to make. Lingering in this section, the group started coughing as they searched. Phil noticed the smoke from their lamps could be building up, so he fanned the air with his hand as they searched. Eventually, they found the pathway and ventured further into the cave. As they were walking, some of the boys complained about dizziness. Others were getting headaches. Phil was concerned, but he thought the dim lights could be impacting the kids. The cave was slightly damp from seasonal rainfall, which eased Phil's concerns. If any of them tripped, the waters would make it hard for fire to spread from a broken lamp. The group reached a large room with smooth, rounded walls and marveled at the cave and its layers of multicolored rock. They pushed onward to a canyon that descended further than the first dip. They stayed on the ledge, but one of the boys got dizzy. Another scout grabbed his arm to stabilize him. Phil turned around, tense and ready to spring into action, but the boy was safely pulled away from the ledge. Phil brought him to the front of the pack to keep an eye on him. Some of the boys were breathing heavily as they got to a room with strange writing on the walls. Phil explained that Howard's Waterfall Cave was a sacred place for Cherokee natives in the area. Their legends told that caves were portals to a hellish underworld. Few members of the various Cherokee clans dared to venture into the cave, but those who did felt empowered after overcoming the dangers of Earth's depths. Whenever brave souls did journey into Howard's, they left their signatures and messages along the cave walls. In his master's degree thesis, anthropologist Bo Carroll compared these signatures to the graffiti present in the cave today. Only these old markings weren't full of harmful chemicals that could destroy the rare species of insects and other creatures living in the cave. Phil's tale inspired the boys, and they all wanted to leave their own messages along the wall to show they had conquered the cave. The old markings in this room were made in the syllabary language of the Cherokee. Along with signatures, Howard's Waterfall Cave had a message scrawled on its walls. This message was written by a man named Goose, whose writings appear on different caves across Georgia. The message looming above the Boy Scouts roughly says, quote, "We found them and split them among us, taking back what was ours. Even after the United States outlawed Cherokee laws, Goose and his clanmates avenged the deaths of their fellow tribe members by evoking their own blood law. To balance their losses, they killed 3 people and possibly disposed of their scalped bodies somewhere in Howard's Waterfall Cave." The group had no idea what these mysterious markings meant at the time, but as they gazed at the rock, the letters started to move as their vision began to blur. On the way back, they started to feel exhausted, and they were breathing more heavily and faster. Their pulses started to quicken, which only led to more fear and anxiety. Phil was experiencing it too, and he wasn't sure why his heart rate was going up. The cave wasn't challenging, and they weren't struggling physically outside of these strange effects. They kept walking, feeling the blood pulse in their ears. They reached the round-walled room near the maze area when they noticed it, a strange smell starting to fill the air. Phil immediately covered his face and warned the kids to back up, waving his other arm. He feared that the group had already been exposed to carbon dioxide gases or other deadly fumes from below ground. The carbide lamps they carried used acetylene gas to fuel their flames. These lamps are sometimes called smokers because they produce dark plumes of carbon that fog up the air around them. Along with the flame, burning acetylene also produces 2 parts carbon dioxide to 1 part water vapor. CO2 is deadly, but it's also colorless and odorless. Other culprits could be carbon monoxide or flammable methane. These chemicals can often be found in mines where the exhaust from heavy machinery builds up. Sometimes in lava caves, hydrogen sulfide gas can waft from burning sulfur deep underground, creating the rotten egg smell found around many hot springs. But the area had no known volcanic activity. Phil was considering the possibilities, thinking about what to do, when the cave made the decision for him. A ball of fire engulfed the back of the group. An explosion shook the earth, and a shockwave sent Phil and the boys flying off their feet and into the walls of the cave. Fire consumed some of the boys. After the initial blast, the rumble of a cave-in sounded in front of them, battering their ears and stinging their eyes with dust. Rescue in the Cherokee underworld. The whole town heard the blast. It reverberated for miles across the Georgia wilderness, sending birds into the sky. One of the town's residents, Rusty Mills, was only 18 when he heard the explosion, but he was one of the town's biggest cavers. The Boy Scouts trapped in Howard's waterfall cave were the same age he was when he found his love of caving. He had ventured up into Tennessee and braved many of the caves in the area, so he knew Howard's like the back of his hand. Rusty's pal, Bernie Gilly, was also a young adult, just 1 year older than Rusty. Rusty found Bernie congregating in the town square. The families of the Scouts knew their boys were below ground, and smoke and dirt were rising from the direction of Howard's waterfall cave. Mothers shrieked as firefighters, police, and medics all rallied toward the cave. Rusty and Bernie pulled up their sleeves and chased after them. Phil's vision was blurry, but he stumbled to his feet in spite of his daze. One boy's clothing was on fire. A few others were lying on the ground, not moving. Some were bleeding and had signs of bone injuries. Phil himself grasped his side. The pain in his chest signaled a broken rib, but he stumbled forward and slapped the fire with his arm while helping the boy roll on the floor to extinguish the fire. Many of the lights were burnt out. The boy near the back of the room had suffered the brunt of the impact. He was a 16-year-old with more maturity than the younger group members, so he was tasked with being the last person in line to keep an eye on his fellow scouts. His brass-colored headlamp was now black, and only twisted scraps of it were left strewn about the room. Phil saw shards of glass had impaled another boy that was close to him. Without thinking, he knew the boy's lamp must have exploded. He didn't know how, and he didn't care why. He had to get the boys out of the cave. But as he turned back around, he saw the exit was buried under tons of rubble. There wasn't much light left in the cave after many of them had broken their lamps. Phil realized the acetylene gas could spark another fireball, so he frantically thought about what to do. The smell was returning to the room, and even though the explosion started in the back, the smell was worse near the rubble. So he took a chance, and he placed the few remaining lamps outside of the room, and commanded some of the boys to move beyond the room while he tried to pick up unconscious scouts. All the while, he struggled to breathe from his injuries and the nauseous air. Phil then started digging through the rock, but he didn't get far. Whatever was bothering them before was thick in the air near the rubble, and the fire had burned away most of the clean air in this pocket. In place of oxygen, the gas from their broken lamps now filled their lungs. Rusty and Bernie could smell the air before they even got into the cave. It didn't smell like a foul air cave or like burning lamps. It smelled like gasoline. The fire department wasn't equipped to provide all the rescuers with protection from the toxic fumes, so much of the crew decided to stay outside. They contemplated what to do. Only a few people could enter the cave, and that might not be enough. Who knows if they were still alive? And how many more could die if they risked it without gas masks? Rusty and Bernie were already shirtless. They dipped their shirts in the waterfall outside the cave and tied them around their faces. Hopefully, the water would absorb some of the chemicals, and they could avoid succumbing to the gas that had tainted the air of Howard's waterfall cave. The few rescuers brave enough to go inside rushed past the first few areas. Rusty had no trouble finding the tricky left turn that stopped the scouts earlier. They were already coughing and feeling lightheaded when they found the mound of rubble. They communicated to Phil on the other side and confirmed that they were all still alive, but one of the boys wasn't doing very well. It seemed like one of his lamps had exploded. The firefighters told him to turn off all lights, and they did the same. The pair of about 4 people, including Rusty and Bernie, started digging through the rubble in total darkness. They were quickly able to get a small hole open through the rock, and they cautiously turned a light back on to assess the situation in what's now known as the disaster room. Phil was still barely conscious on the other side as he flailed his arms trying to grab and move rocks, but his body was going limp. Bernie quickly reached across the small opening and gave Phil his shirt to shield him with whatever sliver of protection it could bring. Hours passed by as the teams worked, with the fire crew on the left side of the cave-in, Rusty in the middle, and Bernie on the right. As they kept shoving stones tumbling down to the cave floor, Rusty noticed the sounds were getting quieter on one side. He turned his lamp on and saw Bernie gasping for breath. As Rusty put a hand on his friend's shoulder, the fireman called to them. With just one more boulder, they could start getting the Boy Scouts out of the room one at a time. Bernie rose on shaky legs and joined with the other rescuers. The two firefighters, Rusty and Bernie, all pushed their whole might into the side of the rock. The boulder gave way, and Phil dragged himself to the first scout and helped him through the jagged opening in the rubble. The first firefighter scooped him up and made a dash for the exit. Bernie collapsed on the rubble. Rusty knelt down and helped move Bernie off the mound of rock to continue digging. They couldn't bring him out right now, he was too heavy. They thought they could help him later, but they had to dig faster or they'd succumb to the gas too, and all would be lost. Phil had also collapsed on the other side. The remaining rescuers had to get the hole big enough to climb through. Rusty was smaller, more wiry, and agile from his days of caving, so once the hole was big enough, he squeezed through and brought the boys through the hole. Once the final scout was on the other side, Rusty turned toward Phil. His vision was darkening, but he knelt down beside the group leader. Phil was already gone. He started to squeeze through the crack once again, but other rocks had dislodged, which made the opening too small for him to pass through. Both firefighters were gone, struggling to get the boys out. Rusty pulled all his remaining might as his head and heart felt like they were about to explode. He dislodged one more rock and tumbled down the other side. He found Bernie stiff and motionless where he left him. With tears in his eyes, Rusty tried to move to the exit, but his legs turned to rubber and he fell on his face. Outside, the firefighters were getting oxygen to the boys as they tried to catch their own breath. They turned around and went back into the cave. The chamber of the cave was oddly quiet when they got there. They saw Rusty lying face down near the rock pile with a deep red pool of blood cascading from under him. He was still alive, but barely. The rescuers found Bernie and wormed through the hole to Phil. They shouldered Rusty together and departed the cave. Once they got outside, they laid Rusty on the grass. He wasn't breathing. They tried CPR, but it was no use. The scouts were saved, but their troop leader Phil Howell and two of the young rescue crew, Rusty Mills and Bernie Gilly, had all given up their lives to save them. Later discoveries revealed a nearby gas station developed a leak in their underground gas tank. Toxic fumes evaporated and seeped into the cave, just above the disaster room. Today, Howard's Waterfall Cave is managed by the Southeastern Cave Conservancy Incorporated, or the SCCI. It was the first cave donated to the group, and since then, they've grown to manage nearly 180 caves across 7 states. The Mills family donated Rusty's cave notes to the SCCI, and they revealed that Rusty had recently found a brand new sinkhole cave before he died. To honor his memory, the SCCI named the new pit Rusty's Cave in his honor. Howard's Waterfall Cave is now gated to protect the cave from vandals, and to protect innocent lives from the dangers of the cave itself. Beneath the cold, grassy hills of the Yorkshire Dales, disaster struck a group of 9 cavers during their exploration of the Gaping Gill cave system. The United Kingdom's cave rescue organization was worn out from a year filled with tragedy. The year was almost over. Rescuers were looking forward to a better year, but on December 21st, 2019, they were called to the Gaping Gill cave one more time. Did rescuers end their year with a victory, or were more lives claimed by the UK's dark tunnels? Find out as we explore the Gaping Gill Cave Rescue. The group of 9 began their trip to Gaping Gill by departing on the nearly 3-mile hike north of the village of Clapham. Along the way, the cavers passed by the Ingleborough Show Cave, which has introduced countless families and curious explorers to the world of caving. Many cavers have started their hobby at Ingleborough before moving on to try real caving in the neighboring Gaping Gill system. There are 21 different entrances to Gaping Gill, with many requiring SRT, or single rope techniques, to descend and ascend the cave's multiple vertical sections. Reaching the main entrance of Gaping Gill, the cavers saw flat rocks interspersed with veins of grass that ended at a large crack. On the other side, steep, grassy hills terminated at stone ledges covered in moss. The nearby Fellbeck stream flowed into the cave. The flow of water changes with the seasons, but it was abnormally active for that time of year. Above the sinkhole, a wooden fence blocked the area off from the rest of the plains to prevent pigs or other livestock from sliding into the pit. Gaping Gill is frequented by the Bradford Pothole Club and the Craven Pothole Club, and these groups host a yearly winch meet, allowing visitors to enter the cave safely. Other cavers from far and wide can also check out the cave during this event, and tents are set up along the river. The caving clubs have strict policies for the event to prevent accidents. Even though it's much more dangerous than a show cave, people still come from all over just for the winch ride into the main room. The winch hung above a 322-foot chasm that looked endless from the pit above. On the ride down, one of Gaping Gill's many waterfalls misted the cavers while the grind of the metal device clanged in their ears as they descended. At the bottom of the winch, visitors can experience the layered rock of the massive main chamber of the cave, and marvel at the largest unbroken waterfall in England, which is nearly double the height of Niagara Falls. These photo spots are great for visitors and cavers alike, but Gaping Gill's multiple large waterfalls can also be deadly under the wrong conditions. Cavers who travel to truly explore Gaping Gill are also required to have public liability insurance from the British Caving Association in case of disasters. Years back, the first person to descend the crack had to call off the expedition when he noticed his rope was tearing apart as it scraped against the stone, an ominous beginning to a cave that so many dare to explore. The group of 9 cavers split into teams of 2s that could cover more ground. Each group was supposed to explore different passages of Gaping Gill, but one pair of 22-year-old men were trying to get the most out of this trip to Gaping Gill. They couldn't see it all before their cutoff time, but they were surely going to try. From the enormous main shaft of Gaping Gill, the cavers could go through 4 different passages. 2 passages connect to a junction which winds down to the southeast passage. This route is mostly small tunnels, requiring cavers to crawl or duck if they're short enough. Turning north at the next T intersection takes cavers to the Sand Cavern, where the sharp stone jutting out from the wall looks eerie bluish-green in the dim yellow light of headlamps. The Sand Cavern connects to the Stream Chamber and Stream Passage, which are normally very wet. During the winter, these routes could be dangerously cold. A separate passage to the east takes cavers through a long crawl to a large circular tunnel called Hensler's Series, which goes south into another stream. The longest route heads east from the main shaft. On the east slope, boulders reach the ceiling, which sometimes block the routes beyond this area. This section has had multiple breakdowns, and there's no telling when another avalanche of boulders could break apart and block the passage once more, trapping or crushing cavers deep underground. If cavers can traverse the passages on this side, they'll move through the Mud Hall and Avalanche Pot before traveling down sections that go all the way to Ingleborough. However, few attempt that trip because it requires cave diving in dangerously tight tunnels. After the pairs of cavers all finished their initial exploration of Gaping Gill, they all turned around to meet up back at the main chamber. They each crawled and dug their way back through the tunnels. The way back was harder, because water was slowly turning the dirt into mud, which filled the tunnels and made it hard to grip the stone. Pair after pair heard the sound of the waterfall and felt a breeze rushing past them as they returned to the main chamber. This massive room would be almost twice as large if cavers somehow removed all the boulders and stone stacked dozens of feet high below them. One of the cavers couldn't help but feel uneasy as they stomped their way through the crunchy pebble-covered room. The floor below could have a hole from the waterfall, and it could give way at any moment, creating a funnel of rock that would drag them down, crushing and burying them alive. Once the last group arrived, the team had a break, talked, did a head count, and filed in a line toward their scheduled exit point. Now, instead of going back up the main pitch, they were headed to the bar pot entrance. To get there, the 9 cavers went back to the southeast passage before descending through rooms below what's known as the flood entrance. Then, just past that area, they would have to ascend a number of pitches to exit bar pot. Instead of splintering into pairs, they were all supposed to follow the same route. So it should have been a straight shot out of the cave. But that's when everything went all wrong. Bar Pot was a popular entrance and exit to Gaping Gill, but these 2 adventurous cavers wanted to try something new. After all, part of the thrill of caving is the exploration. These 2 took a turn, believing this route would eventually connect with the same path the rest of the group was taking. Their route ended up taking a lot longer than they expected, but they weren't sure why. Meanwhile, the main group had a tough time. Bar Pot has several dangerous sections, including a gap that can be covered by water from the flood entrance, a 108-foot climb done with ropes, then a tricky climb with steep walls that leads to another 46-foot tall shaft. Along the way, they had to traverse tight wedges with water trickling down the smooth rocks, which made it nearly impossible to find stable hand or footholds. Once on top of the second pitch, the main group had to conquer another steep crawl before they could finally exit Gaping Gill. As they climbed out of Bar Pot, the water flowing down started to get worse. It became harder to see the path above as streams flowed over each of the cavers. The caver at the end of the line was getting anxious as water slowly filled the chasm below and started climbing up his boots. It was this person's job to de-rig the ropes on the way up so they could take all their gear with them on the way out. All of the cavers were tired, and the person taking down the ropes was in a hurry, fearing the dangerously high water. Once they wrapped up the de-rigging, the group assumed that everyone had already exited, and they walked back to their camp. Eventually, their hearts sank as they realized the pair of 22-year-olds were still below ground in Gaping Gill, and above ground, rain started to pour onto the Yorkshire Dales. After the 2 men recognized part of the cave from the map, they realized they had missed the turn from the main into Mud Hensler's Crawl, which leads down to the South Hensler's Crawl and connects to the Bar Pot area. Instead, they went down Avalanche Pot and took a right turn down the Far East Tunnel. At that point, they were also aware that water levels were quickly rising inside the cave. Their best chance to make it out of Gaping Gill alive was through Corky's Pot. Corky's Pot has 7 vertical climbs with ropes, making it a difficult journey. The cavers were able to climb the first wall, the 131-foot Vindication pitch, but they ran into trouble further up. The entrance to Corky's Pot has been reinforced with a tube that sticks out of the ground like a well. The cover on top has holes so water can get through, and without the grass and rocks to soak up some of the runoff, the tube funnels water directly into the cave. As they crested another ledge, they found water rushing from above had completely drenched the ropes and flooded the narrow chambers near the surface. The path through Corky's Pot was blocked. It took the cavers a long time just to reach Corky's Pot through the much longer and more arduous path that they traveled, and now they knew they were late. They realized their mistake, and they took the long path back to the main room. The whole way through, water continued to chill them to their cores. The possibility of drowning was sinking in, and they raced through the cave as fast as they could. They eventually reached the Bar Pot shaft, where their other cavers had exited. The 2 men turned the corner, hoping to see someone waiting for them, but there was no one there. The situation was even worse than they imagined. They looked up in horror. Their team took the ropes. They were trapped in Gaping Gill. The time was 12:05 a.m. when the concerned group of cavers above ground made the call to the Cave Rescue Organization. In 2019, the CRO had more body recovery missions than any other year in the history of the organization. In response to their year of misfortune, the CRO invested in new off-road vehicles to assist in further missions. Luckily for the 2 lost cavers, they brought out their new Honda Pioneer ATV for the first time during this rescue. This rugged off-road vehicle has independent front and rear suspension for tackling the rocky terrain of the Yorkshire Dales. It can hold up to 1,000 pounds on its tilt bed and it can tow another 2,500 pounds. This new tech investment paid for itself on this first mission, but would they be hauling back 2 chilly but thankful cavers, or 2 bodies? The CRO team parked their larger Land Rover at Tro Gill, which is a nearby rocky valley, and got ready for their life-saving operation. During all previous rescues, the team would have to carry their heavy equipment, including rows of anchors, metal clips, ropes, wire ladders, stretchers, helmets, food, hammers, power tools, and sometimes even scuba equipment from the Land Rover all the way to the various cave entrances, which could be miles away. The Yorkshire Dales National Park is a vast stretch of empty plains and rural farmland. Many of the caves are located well off the beaten path, and during storms, the few dirt and gravel roads that stretch into the park can easily get flooded. The caves of the Yorkshire Dales are spread out all across the park, and some systems, like the Gaping Gill Cave, have multiple entrances. Their new ATV could quickly ferry this heavy gear to and from different cave entrances, which saved precious time as the rescuers walked for almost 2 miles to reach the cave entrances. Since the rescuers didn't have to carry as much gear, they didn't expend any of their own energy on the walk to the cave, which was a relief. Who knows what dangers they could face. They also had split into teams to cover more ground, so the team controlling the ATV also doubled as a communication hub to relay info between the various teams in case cell reception was lacking out in the countryside. The controllers of the operation analyzed the layout of the cave and the route the cavers had traveled. They realized that one wrong turn could have sent them along the path to Corky's Pot, so they started their search there. Other teams went to the Bar Pot entrance to check there. As the first team squeezed into the Corky's Pot entrance, they immediately realized there was a problem. Melting snow created high water flow into the cave, and it was made even worse by rainfall. The CRO tried to explore Corky's Pot, but the flooding was too dangerous. They retreated to the surface to come up with a different plan. Meanwhile, the Bar Pot team was able to slip down the crack and begin rigging their lines in the rain. This team was going much more slowly than the Corky's Pot team. So far, this path looked like it was safe to travel for now, but it would take a while to move safely through the treacherous pitches. As time dragged on, the conditions inside and outside of Gaping Gill worsened. The controller decided they needed more rescuers if they were going to save the 2 missing cavers in time. They called for backup from the Upper Wharfedale Fell Rescue Association. Minutes later, the first rescuers touched down below the Bar Pot entrance. They readied themselves for the worst. If any of the passages here were blocked, they were in for a large-scale rescue that could take days, and the men might not make it out alive. The rescuers continued to venture into the dark depths below the Yorkshire Dales, and before long, they were shocked to find the 2 missing cavers. Rescuers had half expected them to search for another exit after seeing that Bar Pot was de-rigged, but they did the right thing. The cavers could have looked for a different exit, and if they got lucky, they could have dodged the floods and made it out safely on their own, but the experience of the rescue team in Corky's Pot proved that that would have been a risky plan that could have led to their death by drowning or by exposure to the elements. Instead, the safest plan was to stay put in a place along their scheduled route. Luckily, the spot they chose to rest was sheltered from the pouring water. The CRO's new equipment and their ability to cover more ground helped rescuers reach the cavers before their situation could deteriorate. They got to them so fast that they weren't in any risk of starvation or exposure. So, instead of using stretchers, the 2 cavers were let out of the cave on their own accord. Shortly before, they climbed through the muck and grime and felt the breeze of the sky once more. The backup rescuers arrived at the base camp. While they couldn't get additional volunteer hours logged, they were relieved that the rescue seemed to be a success. But of course, they didn't want to get too optimistic. They'd let their guard down only when they came face to face with the missing cavers to confirm they were safe. The CRO Land Rover was waiting to take the pair to the village of Clapham to rest their nerves. The other 7 cavers from the group were still waiting above ground at the Operations Command Center with the controller and other CRO rescuers. The lost cavers' friends celebrated their safe return, and they had some classic tea and biscuits, or cookies as they're called overseas. Once everyone was together again, the rescuers could breathe easy and celebrate their own successful rescue. Unfortunately for the 2 rescued cavers, their nightmares weren't over. Just 1 month later, the pair would find themselves in a dire situation once again below a different Yorkshire Dales cave. Subscribe to the channel to see if these two cavers survived 2 cave rescues in just 2 months. In the spring of 2019, a group of 6 old-school cavers climbed down the jagged pothole leading to Virginia's Cyclops Cave. The rough-and-tumble group planned to stay overnight in Cyclops Cave's extensive 7-mile tunnel system. They entered expecting to see beautiful cave formations, but what they saw shocked them. The 6 cavers turned around just hours into their journey, but only one man made it out on his own. What happened to the other 5 cavers? Find out as we relive the Cyclops Cave rescue. On Friday evening, the band of 6 adventurers packed their trucks with some old work clothes, worn and faded hoodies, pants, boots, some helmets and light sources, and some sleeping gear. The youngest in the group was 22, while the others ranged from 34 to 59. The older cavers were used to toughing it out and exploring on their own. They grew up without the internet to learn how to cave properly, and they felt ready to endure what lay in wait below ground. Their tires ripped up the dirt roads leading into the Virginia wilderness as the sun began to set behind the forest trees. After parking near a dirt road, the men climbed up a steep hill lined with rocks, small trees, and undergrowth. They reached a craggy, sharp pothole with moss-covered rocks that snaked down into the darkness, marking the entrance of Cyclops Cave. At 7 p.m., the 6 men carefully gripped the dirt and rocks at the edge of the deep drop. Without ropes, they had to rely on their own calloused hands to prevent falling to their death. And one by one, they left the light behind and entered the cave. Cyclops Cave is located at the edge of Virginia's Karst Range in an area called Sinkhole Valley in Russell County. It's a wild cave that's had almost no alterations by human hands. The only additions are some anchors for ropes. Novice cavers are advised to stay away from Cyclops because it contains almost every hazard imaginable. The group of 6 would-be cavers immediately met the first challenge of Cyclops as they struggled to descend the first section of the cave. They thought there would be a simple climb down, but there are actually 8 different pitches that each extend 20 to 50 feet down. To make matters worse, the horizontal passages connecting these climbs were extremely tight and coated in thick mud. The men dug and crawled their way through the cave, barely fitting at some points, and each muddy section made the next climb even harder as they struggled to keep their grip without the proper gear. Beyond this hellish section, they entered the main passage of the cave, which has a 40-foot-tall, rounded roof with a feature known as the fountain, which is a thin waterfall made from droplets of water to form stalagmites below. The sharp, slab-like rocks from the entrance turn into smooth dripstone near a small waterfall by the main passage. Upstream, the cave connects to a permanently flooded sump. Only experienced divers should ever attempt to explore beyond this point. In some caves, sumps have crystal clear water, allowing cavers to see the junction. Sometimes these waters tempt cavers to free dive without any scuba gear. No goggles, fins, or air to breathe. And sometimes they make it. But in the murky water of Cyclops, a free dive would have been a death sentence. The 6 men had no diving gear, so there was no way they could try this portion and live to tell the tale. In the opposite direction, the cavers followed along the underground river pathway. They crouched and crawled, trying to avoid the water through this strange passage which has multiple sections denoting the water height over the years. In this section, even the stalactites on the ceiling are caked in mud. As they explored, they started to feel drops of water trickle down from above. They chalked it up to being lower than the sump they saw earlier, and moved forward to Prometheus Junction. Then they reached another vertical hole. This borehole was even harder than before, since they had the horrible idea to enter the cave at night, after they were already tired from the day. They planned to camp, so they thought their sleepiness wouldn't matter. But cavers should camp before they use all their energy. That way, they always have some left in reserve in case of emergencies. At this point, the water was starting to soak into their clothes as they struggled down. They even heard the flow of water ahead as they entered a passage with yellowed ceilings and bluish-green shelves formed by slow drops of water from above. Only this time, the water was almost pouring down the mineral-covered rock. From there, they reached a connection to Rapture River, a roughly 40-foot-high canyon where the river flows rapidly at the bottom. This is where they made their next major mistake. The pitch down to the riverbed is permanently rigged with a rope for cavers to descend, but the rope hangs dangerously close to the waterfall. The water flowing into Rapture River looked calm along the upper portion, but over the ledge, the water was raging. Climbing down this section would be incredibly dangerous even in low water, but the water inside Cyclops Cave was getting worse. The cavers had no way of knowing, but Rapture River was more than 20 feet higher than normal that day, and it was still rising. Because of the cave's length, its water, and its proximity to unique habitats along the Clinch River, researchers estimate Cyclops Cave could be home to unique invertebrate species and other amazing finds, like horn coral fossils. Further down the cave, the 6 cavers expected to see dripstone pools, tall white stalactites, shelves of thin, almost transparent rock, and layers of almost alien formations. But they would never reach those wonderful sights. One of the cavers tried descending the rope as the water soaked his clothes. As he got down, he squinted through the mist spraying his face, but he couldn't find the passage. He slowly climbed back up, slipping at one point, but he managed to hold on with brute strength. When he neared the top, his fellow cavers bent down to pull him onto the ledge. He was soaked, and the way forward was blocked. They realized the water must be too high, so they scrapped their plans for camping and turned around. As they backtracked, the water continued to get worse as, unbeknownst to them, a rainstorm had started above ground. As they reached the narrow tubes near the entrance, they were shocked to find water pouring from the tunnels. Their exit was completely flooded. For nearly 2 days, the group sat below ground as the water stole all the warmth from their bones as it continued to pour into the cave, seemingly from every direction. They had ignored one of caving's most basic rules. They didn't tell anyone where they were going. To make matters worse, the mud was draining their heat even faster. Even past the entrance, most of Cyclops is very muddy. New cavers often think mud is just a nuisance. They might even enjoy muddy caves. But over time, mud gets very cold, and it can be deadly because it has high thermal mass. That means mud can store a lot of energy, which is why mud walls are used in construction in some countries. They absorb the energy of the sun and they release it later, instead of trapping warm air like insulation. But that property of mud can be a double-edged sword. When mud is cold, it's even harder to warm up. The mud wove its way into every fiber of their clothing, preventing it from trapping their body heat. Instead, all of their warmth was sucked into the thick, wet mud that encased them and felt as cold as snow. If the cavers were outside in mild conditions, the mud would eventually reach the same temperature as their bodies, but in the cool, nearly freezing air of the cave, their bodies were constantly radiating warmth while the cave air continuously cooled it. It was a fight they would eventually lose. No human alive has enough energy in their body to warm a 7-mile-long cave. Over time, they would lose so much energy they would die, and their corpses would become as cold as the mud and chilly winds of the cave. After nearly 2 days trapped underground, the rain finally halted, but by then, many of the cavers were too weak from their battle against the cold. They couldn't climb out. Now, as if their situation wasn't dire enough, They were also out of food and water. They had no cell phone reception and no chance of survival. When all seemed lost, the younger member of the group, the 22-year-old, rallied his strength and pushed past his limits as he dug through the muddy death traps once again. His weary friends cheered him on as his boots disappeared in the long tunnels. But somehow, at 2 a.m. on Sunday, the unnamed man reached the last pitch. He pushed past the pain and wedged his body against the wall to catch his breath as he slowly climbed up and exited Cyclops Cave. He stumbled down the path and called for help. He reached emergency coordinator Jeff Powers. Luckily, even though his group seemingly knew nothing about caving, he was smart enough to assess the physical condition of the other cavers before he left. He gave detailed information to the dispatch, including info on the physical characteristics of the cavers, any medical problems they may have had in the past or present, and where they were trapped. This information would be vital to the rescuers, and it sped up the planning stage. Unfortunately, the county emergency response crew lacked cave rescue gear, so the Virginia Department of Emergency Management sent their own search and rescue coordinator to help plan the rescue. The Blacksburg Volunteer Rescue Squad sent 23 members along with their cave rescue trailer to get the project started. Then, the Black Diamond Search and Rescue Coordinator Michael Maggard also drove to the Virginia wilderness to help with the rescue. The quickly growing rescue team had to figure out how to approach this situation. The rocky and the steep hill outside of the cave was a problem. They had to haul all their gear up the hill, which could wear them out. To save energy, they spent the next 8 hours planning every detail of the rescue using detailed maps of the cave. At 10:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, the team began hauling their gear up the hill to the entrance of Cyclops Cave. And, just as they started their hike, cavers from Tennessee and North Carolina also arrived to lend their aid. The rescuers knew there were no ropes outside the cave, so they had to rig their own entry ropes to keep themselves and the trapped cavers safe. Crews tied multiple ropes around a small tree. In the wet mud, the weight of only a few people could pull the tree to the ground, so they connected other ropes to even more trees to create a chain that formed a secure anchor for their ropes. Next, they added a pulley system. The pulley's main rope was connected straight to a nearby tree parallel to the ground, and rescuers used a large woven nylon anchor for added support. That's the same material seatbelts are made from. They tied the strap around another tree and secured it to the pulley using a locking clip so that the pulley had multiple points of failure. If one support broke, the pulley wouldn't fall down the hole. Rescuers attached a bucket to the pulley to bring the trapped cavers out of the hole. A rescuer was scheduled to climb up the exit as the bucket rose to keep watch and prevent anything from going wrong. But since they were all on the same rope system, their added weight could snap the tree or break one of the clips. Multiple other rescuers held the ropes during ascents and descents for even more security. Rescuers used single rope climbing techniques to enter the cave while lugging multiple metal clips, first aid packs, a spool of wire for communications, a rescue backpack which could house the basket stretcher or other supplies like solid waste removal bags, and extra light sources. As the first rescuers began the tight climb down into Cyclops Cave, an angry property owner arrived at the rescue site. It turned out the cave was on private property, and the cavers didn't have permission to be there. Rescuers had to direct the property owner away from the operation to prevent interference as they tried to calm him down. He couldn't stop the rescue, but he could make life hell for the cavers, even if they managed to make it out alive. Trespassing and other charges could be brought against the cavers, which could lead to financial ruin, family and relationship problems, and even infamy among the caving community. As the days slowly passed by, the trapped cavers were losing hope as they thought of all the ways they might die. Rescuers pushed through the tight chambers until they reached a block. The mud had dried in some areas, leaving the passage totally impassable. The team inside the cave called for power tools to dig through the passages faster. The tools came in handy again when they reached even tighter passageways. These constricted tunnels would be too tight for the rescue bucket to pass through, so they had to drill and chip away at the rock, permanently changing the difficulty of the route. Rescuers were scheduled to connect with the cavers shortly after they passed through the difficult entryway. The trapped cavers were supposed to be on the right, on the other side, near the chilling breeze of the underground river. The passage was quiet as the rescuers approached. The rescuers didn't know what to expect. After all, the cavers weren't dressed properly, and they had likely ran out of food and water. Rescuer Eric Stanley was with the first group as they pressed through the 300-foot entrance of the cave. And as they pushed through the last tunnel into the main cave chamber, he saw the trapped cavers. They were all alive. The 5 trapped men were relieved and happy to see rescuers. Their gloom turned to joy as other rescuers rigged hauled lines to get them up the various cliffs of Cyclops Cave. The cavers were too tired, with practically no rest, and they were all suffering from hypothermia caused by their mud-drenched clothes. The first rescue team gave the cavers blankets and water, and they stayed with them to assess their condition while the other rescuers finished preparing for the extraction. The team helped the first caver into the rescue basket and placed a guard strap across his sternum to prevent rocks from scraping against his flesh as they hoisted the bucket through the narrow tunnels. At the top, rescuers needed help to get up the muddy slope, so other rescuers extended hands and pulled them up the slope to stay with the first basket while others went down. As they were extracting the first casualty, the condition of one of the other cavers started to worsen. They quickly got him out of the cave next, and a full team stayed with the stretcher as they dragged it across the ground. A spotter called out possible hazards like rocks or holes so that the team could react ahead of time, lifting the canoe or changing directions to avoid collision. The bucket was also connected via another strong nylon cable to multiple other rescuers who walked behind the stretcher. That way, even if all hands failed, the casualty wouldn't go far. An ATV hauled the caver on its short flatbed, while others walked alongside the basket for extra security. They drove down yet another hill onto the plains by the road, and loaded the second caver onto a med-flight helicopter to be treated for hypothermia. After an agonizing 47-hour wait inside Cyclops Cave, the rest of the trapped cavers were slowly brought to safety above ground. One caver was capable of walking once he made it out, and he spoke with news crews telling them the Lord watched over them. Nearby, another caver was loaded into an awaiting ambulance for treatment. Although the Cyclops Cave rescue was challenging with its numerous tight twists and turns, the rescuers drew the perfect plans for the haul lines, and everything worked according to plan. It took around an hour for the demobilization process to wrap up, completing the 16-hour rescue operation at Cyclops Cave. Even though the cave is difficult to explore, in the years that followed, more unregistered cavers have squeezed into Cyclops Cave, breaking formations and rigging, and even spraying graffiti on delicate limestone walls. Since then, the Southern Cave Conservancy has purchased the land, gated the entrance, and opened Cyclops Cave to all spelunkers who obtain free permits. Who knows? Maybe some of the men who were rescued that day now comprise the Cyclops Cave Preserve family to ensure that the cave is safe for explorers, sport cavers, and scientific researchers alike. The Alcove House is a massive cavity carved into the side of a canyon in New Mexico. The site was originally built by ancestral Pueblo people, and it sits at a panoramic height of 140 feet above the floor of the canyon. Visitors interested in the history of this visually stunning place come every year to make the climb up to the Alcove House. However, due to its remote location, its impressive height, and a variety of other natural factors, doing this is actually pretty dangerous. The National Park Service is very forthcoming about warning visitors of the dangers, but sadly, these warnings are not always heeded. Finally, in 2022, things went so catastrophically wrong at the Alcove House that it made national news. One of the things that makes the Alcove House so interesting is that it used to be an actual house where people lived. More accurately, it seemed to have really been something akin to an apartment building. Historians estimate that roughly 25 people lived inside the Alcove House. As the name implies, the Alcove House used to have numerous alcoves, or niches, carved into the walls inside it, each of which served as a separate home for a family to live in. These individual homes curved along the inside of the main chamber, surrounding what served as a large communal area in the center for everyone to share. Located in this communal area is a large brick structure called a kiva. Puebloans use the kiva for religious and ceremonial purposes. The kiva in the Alcove House has a fire pit built inside of it, and when it was excavated around the turn of the 20th century, archaeologists found red corn and matting materials that were still extremely well preserved. Despite arguably having the coolest location, this is far from the only kiva which still stands today. In fact, it isn't even the only kiva in the surrounding area. Alcove House is located inside Bandelier National Monument, a roughly 34,000-acre area about a 50-minute drive west of Santa Fe. Bandelier encompasses an area larger than the city of San Francisco and includes the territories, homes, and other structures that belonged to Puebloans from 1150 to 1600 AD. Today, the Alcove House is accessed by following a 1-mile trail inside Bandelier National Monument called the Main Loop. The trail starts out paved, and it makes for a very easy hike, or so it would seem in the beginning. The journey gets progressively more and more strenuous as it goes on. Stairs are introduced, and then along with the stairs, ladders start being introduced as well. The stairways also seem to start getting narrower and windier, while the ladders start to get steeper and longer. Some of these ladders lead to other carved-out areas you can explore and peer out from at the canyon below. Many spots on the canyon wall, both inside and outside the alcoves, have paintings on them. Eventually, you cross over a small bridge and arrive at the base of where the Alcove House is located. As you approach, you'll encounter two things: a conspicuous warning sign, and by far the biggest and steepest ladder on the trail so far. The sign is a notice warning visitors that if they proceed any further, they'll be embarking on a 140-foot ascent. Visitors with a fear of heights or health problems are advised not to attempt scaling the ladder. It also requires that children be closely supervised and insists that if you do decide to brave the climb up the ladder, to make sure the ladder is the only thing you climb on. One can only imagine what transpired to make it necessary for the sign to say this. The ladder itself isn't 140 feet, but at the top it immediately leads to more steep, narrow stairs. Visitors have to amble up these single file. At some points, the walkway becomes so narrow there aren't even stairs. It's just a smooth stone ramp where you have to put one foot in front of the other like you're walking a tightrope. It's amazing, particularly at this point, to remember that what you're climbing up to see is something that was home to numerous people, young and old, many years ago. Soon after this, it's time for a second ladder. This one just as tall and intimidating as the first, but now starting many stories off the ground. This, without a doubt, is the stretch of the journey that poses the biggest threat to those fearful of heights. The whole canyon can be seen below you, and if you make the mistake of turning around to look, it doesn't take much imagination to see how one slip could mean bouncing and crashing all the way back down to the canyon floor. Your reward for braving the second ladder is that once you reach the top, the Alcove House finally comes into full, magnificent view. Aside from being carved out of red rock and being 140 feet above the ground, it looks almost like the Hollywood Bowl. You still have to contend with a couple more, much easier ladders and a few more flights of steep, narrow stairs, but you're on the home stretch at this point. Within a few dozen feet, you enter the massive alcove. There is a good amount to see and explore inside, from the kiva to the various restored alcove homes to the incredible view out of the main entrance, which looks much the way it would have to the original inhabitants of this extraordinary dwelling place. Then, sooner or later, you have no choice but to brave the whole journey again in reverse. Down the stairs, down the ladders, down the single-file walkways, back to the ground where the warning sign first greeted you. As should be obvious by now, this site is distinct from others, and that the most challenging and the most dangerous part of exploring it is getting to it in the first place. You have to be in pretty good shape and be pretty comfortable with heights just to see the alcove house up close. And I promise you, however scary these ladders look on video, they are easily twice as scary when you're standing at the bottom yourself. The ladders seem to be well built and sturdy, but there are still several hazards associated with them that keep park employees in New Mexico awake at night. One is ice. No matter how good the condition of the ladders themselves, and no matter how capable the climber, if you come to Bandelier National Monument in the middle of the winter, there will be snow everywhere, and the rungs of the ladders will be slippery. I'm sure you don't need me to explain why that's a problem. The park doesn't seem to feel the need to explain it either. Every year, they simply close the site, sometimes for weeks at a time, until the weather conditions improve. Another potential danger is that of falling rocks. Unfortunately, ice and falling rocks tend to go together. Particularly as the winter season begins transitioning into spring, snow that's sitting in the cracks begins melting and expanding. This pressure inside the walls of the canyon's various rock formations can sometimes knock things loose and send rocks tumbling down to the canyon floor. These might be pebbles, or they might be lethal boulders. It all just depends on your luck, or lack thereof. Let us now turn to a woman from Illinois who, in the early spring of 2022, had the worst luck of all when she visited the alcove house in New Mexico. Brenda Holzer was a 54-year-old paraprofessional from Yorkville, Illinois. She was said to have a natural ability to care for others, and she loved traveling and nature. In March of 2022, Brenda took a trip to Bandelier National Monument. The week before she had arrived, there had been a snowstorm. It's possible Brenda was aware of the risks associated with this, but the park was open. So, in any case, she decided to try and explore the legendary alcove house. It's safe to say, however, that neither she nor anyone else expected what was to come. On Wednesday, March 23rd, Brenda Holzer made the journey out to Bandelier National Monument. As many visitors have before and after her, she walked along the paved trail called the Main Loop, and eventually past the infamous sign warning of the 140-foot ascent up ahead. Now, you'll remember from the earlier description that there are 4 ladders in total on the journey up to the alcove house. The last 2 are fairly close together and fairly painless. The first immediately follows the warning sign at the canyon floor. It is the second ladder that is probably the scariest, combining length, steepness, and height above the canyon floor for a palm sweat-inducing experience. Brenda made it up the first ladder. She made it up the narrow, single-file stairs. She made it through the smooth ramp where you have to put one foot literally in front of the other. But when she arrived at the second ladder, disaster was only moments away. Surely unaware of what was about to happen, Brenda began climbing this, the most treacherous stretch of the entire journey. It was while she was actively climbing the ladder that, in a stroke of extraordinarily bad luck, a rock decided it was time to become dislodged from the wall of the canyon. Most likely due to melting snow from last week's storm, the rock which came loose during Brenda's harrowing climb was not a pebble. There's no way to know exactly how big the rock was. Even if it had been recovered, it probably would have shattered into many unidentifiable pieces. But we know it must have been fairly big, because it struck Brenda with such force that she was knocked off the ladder. Brenda fell 25 feet, with only jagged rock formations below to land on. Witnesses on the scene who scrambled to her aid reported that they found her, quote, pulseless. Rescue crews were immediately called, but there was nothing they could do to revive Brenda. She'd been killed swiftly. If not by the initial impact of the rock, then surely by the impact of the fall. Authorities immediately closed the whole alcove house area until further notice, and an investigation was opened. The first thing they seemed keen on finding out was whether or not the falling rock had been caused by another person. This would dramatically change the nature of the case. If someone was responsible for the rock falling, they could be legally responsible for Brenda's death, even if it was a complete accident. Another aspect of the investigation that was important was determining whether or not there was any negligence on behalf of park management. Was the path to the alcove house and the surrounding area being properly maintained? Was the falling rock something that could have been prevented with better care? Following this tragic accident, many were quick to point out that in most rock climbing areas around the country, those who work to develop the routes usually maintain them. And a large part of that job is finding and removing loose or dangerous rocks on the route. One person who spoke out about this was a man named Peter Olson. Olson is a longtime climber and resident of nearby Santa Fe. According to Olson, it's true that removing dangerous rocks from rock climbing routes is an important routine task, but it isn't true that the alcove house is a rock climbing route. He told the Santa Fe New Mexican, a local newspaper, that, quote, "Places like Bandelier are not really a rock climbing area. It's a historic area with ladders, and who knows what type of mitigation they did above it." Olson also pointed out that falling rocks causing accidents like this are exceedingly rare events. A former employee at Bandelier National Monument named Craig Allen seemed to agree with this, but also described seeing rock falls regularly during his tenure at the park. He said, quote, "Every year you see rock falls like this somewhere in the canyon, just driving around or hiking. They are common at the level of multiple canyon systems, but the probability of them happening in any one place is pretty low." This all makes it sound as though falling rocks are a well-known and regular phenomena in the park, but the risks associated with them are considered negligibly low, even after this horrific incident. A spokeswoman for the park named Joni Budzaleni seemed to corroborate this when she reported that the park hadn't experienced a similar incident in, quote, "recent history." She also reported that the investigation concluded no other person was involved in the incident. The rock had simply fallen naturally. Brenda Holzer had been married for nearly 31 years, and she was the mother of 3 children. Her death was the epitome of a freak accident, and it shocked and devastated the Illinois community of which she was an upstanding and beloved member. All the available evidence seems to suggest that Brenda was the victim of an extremely unlikely event. However, it isn't necessarily true to say that nothing could have been done to prevent it from happening. One issue worth pointing out is the fact that the park was open just a week after a snowstorm. Park officials are clearly willing to close the park for weeks at a time when conditions are icy, slippery, and dangerous. Brenda didn't slip, but her death was caused by something related to the snowy conditions. Namely, the melting snow that expands in the cracks of the rock formations. Should the park have been closed? Another thing which all of us can take away as a sad but important lesson in Brenda's story is the easy to underestimate power of the unexpected. In a way, the alcove house is a deceptive place. It's deceptive because it seems so obvious what you need to watch out for. Brenda, like anyone else on the ladder, was probably so busy thinking about keeping her balance and not looking down that she probably never saw the rock coming. In the end, it's a sad reminder to all of us that when we're out exploring the new and unknown, there are some dangers for which almost no preparation can save us. Some disaster stories involve famous locations, and they grab the world's attention for that reason. But some of the wildest disaster stories actually fly under the radar simply because they take place in remote areas and involve landmarks that 99% of people have never even heard of. Today, we're going to look at the latter type of story. This wild and improbable series of events sounds like something straight out of an action-adventure film, but it isn't. It really happened back in 2002 in New Mexico. This is the story of Joseph Lobato and the deadly yo-yo pit. Our story takes place in Santa Fe National Forest. Santa Fe National Forest is a 1.6 million acre expanse of protected land in the northern part of New Mexico. The entire forest is high in elevation, never dropping below 5,000 feet and reaching as high as 13,000. It is a popular hiking destination with scenic river gorges, mountain slopes, and lots of what the USDA calls primitive wilderness. Perhaps what they're referring to is the fact that Santa Fe National Forest is located in a very remote region of the United States. The nearest major city is, of course, the state capital, Santa Fe. But despite being such a well-known city, Santa Fe is not actually very large. Less than 90,000 people live there. Beyond that, New Mexico's biggest city, Albuquerque, is over 100 miles away to the south. To the north, east, and west, Santa Fe National Forest looks out across hundreds of miles containing no major cities. The forest sits in the middle of a large swath of the continent where population density is low and nature still reigns supreme. In May of 2002, Santa Fe National Forest has been temporarily closed. The reason is simple. It's fire season. Fire season is a persistently vulnerable time for the forest. For example, the forest will be closed again later on for the exact same reason in May of 2018, and again in May of 2022. Now, while the forest is a popular hiking and camping destination, it is far from being a world-famous U.S. destination like Yosemite or the Grand Canyon. Shutting down the forest does not spark outrage or widespread dismay among the international community. In fact, most people probably don't even know the forest is closed. But one person who surely does know is 29-year-old Joseph Lobato. And he has a plan. He's going to sneak in. May 16th, 2002 was a Friday. Lobato picks up his girlfriend on the way out of town. Together, the pair drive towards the outskirts of Santa Fe. Within just a few miles, they pass out of the city and into a seemingly endless expanse of patchy, rolling, dry land. Most of the drive out to Santa Fe National Forest looks like this. Every mile you cover takes you deeper and deeper into the remote wilderness, and further from the nearest urban center. After about 20 minutes of driving, Lobato exits Route 84 and turns left onto Los Alamos Highway. Along this road, they wind their way east, crossing over the Adawi Bridge and the Rio Grande. About 13 miles later, Lobato makes another left, this time onto Puye Road. This takes the couple gradually out into the mountains. Though strangely, thanks to the city of Santa Fe having one of the highest elevations of any American city, the drive actually takes the couple downhill. Eventually, after much more winding, they arrive at the entrance to Santa Fe National Forest. Normally, a ranger in a small toll booth would collect admission fees and issue passes. But of course, the park is closed. This is where the element of mystery starts to come into play. How do Joseph Lobato, his girlfriend, and his vehicle all get into a state park that has been mandatorily shut down? One possibility is that he simply never encounters any obstruction along the way. Another is that just past the toll booth, cones or temporary fencing have been put up to block the road. Lobato could either move such fencing out of the way or simply park in front of it. Either way, the couple continues driving out completely alone into the vast, empty expanse of Santa Fe National Forest. Before them lies a 1.6 million acre expanse of nothing but wilderness. Now, although breaking the law is not something to condone, especially in regard to a protected forest during fire season, it is admittedly hard not to see the appeal. For the pair, it must feel almost like a return to Eden. As they wander their way through the forest, they begin noticing another extraordinary feature of the forest's landscape, namely, its volcanic formations. These impressive rocks come in all manner of sizes, often in strikingly unusual shapes. It is unknown by anyone, perhaps not even the couple themselves, how long they ultimately spend in the forest before they arrive at their critical location, but eventually, somehow, some way, they do. The location is an ancient volcanic vent roughly 30 feet in diameter. This literal hole in the earth is estimated to drop at least 130 feet down. Other estimates have it as far down as 170 feet. The discrepancy in estimates shows you just how often people are venturing down into it in the first place. As a matter of fact, the vent is so remote that very little information about it even exists in the public record. Two things we know for sure is that it has a name, Pankey's Crater, aka Yo-Yo Pit, and that it is only accessible to high-clearance vehicles, meaning it is well off the beaten path for most visitors. At some point, not long before arriving at the vent, Lobato parks his vehicle, and the couple sets out to explore on foot. Standing at the mouth of this deep, intimidating chasm, the pair both feel a surge of anxiety. With the car motor turned off, and nothing but nature for miles and miles in every direction, all they hear while they gaze into the abyss are the tranquil, distant chirpings of the forest itself. It's a magical moment, maybe the highlight of their excursion. That is, until all of a sudden, Joseph loses grip of his phone. In a surreal flash, Joseph fumbles the device, and the couple watches as it flips and twirls straight down into Yo-Yo Pit. Stunned, at first, neither one knows how to react. Between the two of them, this is the only phone they brought with them. Then, suddenly, Lobato springs into action. To his still reeling girlfriend's disbelief, he's running back toward the car. A minute or two passes. It feels much longer than that. Then Joseph returns. He's carrying a spaghetti-like jumble of equipment that he's just retrieved from his vehicle. As he lays it out on the ground near the lip of Yo-Yo Pit, the specific assortment is revealed. He's brought 2 ropes, a nylon tow strap, a come-along, pulleys, and some heavy-duty chain. With horror, she realizes what her boyfriend is thinking. Is he really going to do what she thinks he's going to do? Don't worry, he assures her. I've done this sort of thing before. In truth, although Lobato is definitely an outdoorsman and a lifelong daredevil, he has no experience with anything that could be called caving. He also neglects to mention that the ropes he's just dug out of the back of his car were purchased at a hardware store, and they are not designed for rappelling or climbing. Using a nearby tree, Joseph is able to wrap the tow rope around to form a girth hitch, from which he suspends the pair of ropes down into the pit. Although it might be hard to see from above, the ropes do in fact reach all the way to the bottom. Joseph gives the ropes a firm tug and shrugs. They seem pretty tight. With his girlfriend peering through her closed fingers, Joseph Lobato holds firmly to the pair of ropes and backs his way over the edge. Once there is no more ground left to walk on, he leans backward, trying desperately not to look behind him, and lowers his foot, placing it against the wall of the vent. So far, so good. Joseph may be using the leverage of a nearby tree, but there's a significant difference in the way he's using the ropes from what constitutes normal safety practice. Joseph has no harness. He's simply in street clothes, holding the rope with his bare hands. Slowly, Joseph crawls his way backward. The lip of Yo-Yo Pit grows taller and taller above him. His anxiety-riddled girlfriend can't bear to watch, and yet she can't look away. To give an idea of just how far below Joseph the floor of the pit is, imagine standing on the roof of a 17-story building. You're high enough that passing traffic on the street below can barely hear you, even if you were to yell through a megaphone. Now, imagine hanging over the side, clinging to some rope you bought at a hardware store. Every step backward along the wall is treacherous. Despite his girlfriend and the sky beyond gradually disappearing above him, Joseph still hasn't reached the bottom. According to later reports, Joseph's girlfriend estimates that he's about halfway down, some 85 feet from the surface and some 85 from the floor, when he loses grip of the rope. Chillingly and bizarrely, she also reports that Joseph is laughing when he slips, and continues to laugh even as he plummets. Although Joseph has totally lost control of his makeshift caving apparatus, he's not in total freefall. Trying desperately to hold onto the rope as he slips, he sustains major rope burns on his hands and his arms. Joseph hits the floor of Yo-Yo Pit with a sickening thud. But astoundingly, he continues to laugh, even post-impact. His voice echoes up from the belly of the chasm. His girlfriend, who is convinced she is trapped inside some twisted nightmare, yells frantically, trying to confirm if he is okay. Joseph yells back that he thinks he's broken his arm. Well, if true, this is really bad news. Getting back out of the pit was already going to be much harder than climbing down into it, and Joseph hadn't even been successful in doing that. Climbing up out of the pit with one arm would be downright impossible. With no phone, their options for calling for help are limited. She realizes that taking the car and searching for a payphone is probably the only way to get help. But she doesn't want to leave Joseph alone and in pain. There must be something they can work out. Some way they can work together and get Joseph back out again. After a few minutes, Joseph has more bad news. He yells up from the bottom of the pit that he can no longer feel anything in his back. Joseph's tone is different now, more panicked. He's still maintaining an attitude that everything will be all right, but there's fear in his voice that wasn't there before. A few minutes after that, Joseph calls up with even worse news. Not only is his arm broken, and not only has he lost all feeling in his back, but now he's struggling to move. In fact, he soon discovers that he's unable to move at all. At this point, Joseph breaks. He realizes he's in critical condition and that he needs medical attention as fast as possible. His cry to his girlfriend is unambiguous. Get help now. Scrambling, she snatches Joseph's keys off the loose gravel that surrounds the gaping Yo-Yo Pit. Trying her best to stay focused, she runs to the car and begins driving back in the direction they came. In 2002, her best bet at finding help fast is by locating a payphone. But with no way to navigate the sprawling forest other than sheer intuition, this takes a while. Several excruciating hours, as a matter of fact. Finally, a 911 call comes in from a payphone located near Santa Fe National Forest. Search and rescue crews rush to the area. Eventually, they find the remote volcanic vent where Joseph Lobato remains trapped, some 45 to 55 yards below the surface. When emergency personnel stand at the edge of Yo-Yo Pit, they can only just make out the shape of Lobato lying at the bottom. They call out to him, but eerily, they get no response. Multiple crew members rig the pit and start rappelling down, making the same harrowing journey as Lobato had, only this time with proper equipment. They reach the bottom, and soon they reach Lobato, who remains unresponsive. Soon, they confirm the worst. Sometime after his girlfriend had left and sometime before crews had arrived, 29-year-old Joseph Lobato died at the bottom of Yo-Yo Pit. What began as a romantic, although totally illegal, adventure in the wilderness had now turned into an unspeakable disaster. Lobato's body is soon placed in a rescue basket and slowly hauled up out of the pit. Autopsy reports show that Lobato was right. He had broken his arm. But his cause of death was ultimately internal, most likely neurogenic shock or internal hemorrhage. Lobato had also managed to sustain fractures in both his legs. In the eyes of friends and family, Lobato's death is a shocking and devastating blow. For his girlfriend, the traumatic event will surely never be forgotten. In the eyes of local law enforcement, it is a sad, cautionary tale. Outdoor sports like rock climbing and cave exploring are already dangerous, even if you know what you're doing, and even if you bring all the necessary equipment with you. Trying to rappel into a giant volcanic hole using only non-life safety equipment which you just spontaneously retrieved from the trunk of your car? Well, that takes the risk into the stratosphere. We hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. What are your thoughts on the story of Joseph Lobato trying to retrieve his phone from the bottom of Yo-Yo Pit? Please share with us in the comment section below. In July of 2022, over 365,000 pilgrims were venturing on a dangerous trek into a holy site deep within a cave. when their religious journey was suddenly thrown into chaos as heavy rain took them all by surprise. The Indian government underwent a days-long effort to save as many lives as they could, but the caving world is still reeling from this disaster. This is the story of the Amarnath Cave Rescue. The story of Amarnath starts in one of the largest countries in the world, India. India has a storied history dating back thousands of years, and it's fast on the heels of China to become the country with the largest population in the world. India's northern border is home to the most awe-inspiring mountain range in the world, the Himalayas. There are vast cave networks throughout this entire region which have been virtually unexplored due to political tensions in the region. But that hasn't stopped scientists and groups like the Himalayan Cave Club from exploring and cataloging the details of Himalayan caves. In the Nepalese portion of the Himalayas, archaeologists recently discovered over 10,000 prehistoric man-made caves carved into stone, while many more caves are off-limits to spelunkers and explorers because they're holy sites for various religions. Amarnath is one of the most sacred of all the caves in India, and one of the most legendary caves in the entire world. But it's also one of the most deadly. The Blue Hole in Egypt's Red Sea holds the record for the most fatalities claimed inside a single cave. But if you count the trip to and from a cave, the unassuming Amarnath dwarfs all other caves in the world with a death toll over 3 times as much as the Blue Hole, making it the deadliest cave of all time. Why is Amarnath so deadly? And what happened to the hundreds of thousands of explorers trapped there earlier this year? The Amarnath Cave is nestled in the Lidar Valley, formed by the Lidar River as it cut through the Himalayas over time. But Amarnath is special because of a unique formation formed in the lower regions of the cave. Near the end of Amarnath's surveyed region stands a large pillar of ice. This ice is naturally shaped like a traditional representation of the Hindu god Shiva. Known as the god of destruction, Shiva is one of the most revered deities in India and the entire world. Over 15% of the planet follows Hinduism, making the faith the 4th most common in the world, and Shiva is one of the most revered deities in Hinduism. Followers of Shiva will often live ascetic lifestyles. They may eat vegan or vegetarian diets, live and practice yoga or meditation in low-oxygen environments like in mountainous caves. And some may choose to give up worldly possessions and roam the countryside to remain pure. Amarnath is famous for this ice shrine, and pilgrims from around the world travel to the cave to pray before it. This ice shrine is a naturally occurring stalagmite. Normally, these structures are formed out of minerals, but this one is pure ice. The ice grows and shrinks throughout the year depending on the seasons. At its peak, this ice shrine was 20 feet tall, but it's been shrinking every year, causing concern for Hindus and the Indian government. The Indian government has sponsored many surveys into the ice structure to determine the factors that impact its size in order to preserve it. They believe that water levels from outside the cave play a major role, and the body heat from the hundreds of thousands of pilgrims who visit the cave annually also causes the ice to melt and change shape. Unlike many caves in the US, or the caves deep underwater, Amarnath is located high in the mountains. One of the peaks also shares the name Amarnath. The entrance to Amarnath Cave stands tall at 12,760 feet above sea level. Here, the temperatures can average around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, adding to the harsh climate and unique challenge of venturing into Amarnath. The interior of the cave is roughly 130 feet tall at its highest point, and it's mostly made from limestone and gypsum. Amarnath also has rare karst formations. Karsts are almost always made from limestone and dolomite. Gypsum karsts are much more rare, and certain compositions of gypsum karsts are known as alabaster, a white stone revered for its use in artwork and sculptures. Amarnath has a massive entrance with an almost perfectly rectangular mouth that's 120 feet wide and roughly 75 feet tall. The entrance continues 80 feet down into the first main chamber of the cave. Above the entrance, the top portion of the mountain is mostly flat, which adds more character to this already unique cave. Some geologists have speculated that the nearby Lake Shishnog played a vital role in forming Amarnath Cave. In the past, heavy rain created grooves in the mountains, which allowed runoff from the peaks to pool together, which eventually formed Lake Shishnog. This lake is located along the pilgrimage pathway, and it drains into the Litter River in the valley where Amarnath Cave is located. It's been exceedingly difficult for cavers and researchers to explore Amarnath since the sanctity of the site has kept it off limits from geologists who want to study the area. But in recent years, there has been some progress in mapping the cave, and reports from the Indian government have also confirmed an underground lake in the Amarnath Cave. In the past, geologists speculated that the ice stalagmite had been formed by water running down from glaciers and ice deposits around the valley, or from runoff from the ice-capped Amarnath Peak. But now it seems likely that the holy site was formed by flowing water from an underground lake. Amarnath Cave's history predates recorded history. The earliest mentions of the cave were passed down through stories and legends. In the lore, Amarnath Cave was discovered by a wise sage named Brigu as far back as the year 1100, or the 12th century Common Era. This lore describes how Hindus traveled to the cave for prayer. In the legends, Shiva met with his wife Parvati in Amarnath and told her the secrets of life and death. Along with the main ice stalagmite, there are two other naturally formed ice structures in Amarnath. One that represents Parvati, and the other that represents their son, Ganesha. The name Amarnath roughly translates to Immortal Lord, another name for Shiva. Recently, another origin story emerged, saying a shepherd named Bhutta Malik discovered Amarnath. The accuracy of either story is hard to pin down, but the earliest historical accounts state that a king was imprisoned in Amarnath, and eventually the king was executed as guards drowned him in the icy waters of the cave, marking the first of many lives to be claimed by Amarnath. In 1663, French doctor François Bernier wrote about his visit to the Amarnath Cave, marking the first time Western civilization heard of the strange cave. The ancient tradition of journeying to Amarnath for prayer is known as a yatra. Every year, during the 45-day period of the yatras from June 30th to August 15th, roughly 500,000 people journey to Amarnath. Elderly travelers go by horseback, but many believers each make the trip on foot as part of their pilgrimage. More traditional Hindus might take the route from the city of Srinagar, which is a 60-mile walk, while some prefer to walk the shorter route from the smaller town of Pahalgam, which is a 26-mile hike. Visitors to the cave can also travel by bus or take a direct route by helicopter. Unlike true spelunking, these cavers don't bring traditional caving gear, but they do have to pack hard-to-spoil food like cheese, dried fruits, and granola, soap, toilet paper, medicine or first aid packs, warm clothes, 2 pairs of shoes, multiple pairs of socks, and usually a walking stick for the mountainous portion of the journey. The journey takes days, so large encampments are formed along the Litter Valley of the mountain. During the yatras, or pilgrimage, nearly 10,000 people come in and out of Amarnath every single day. While Amarnath is revered and even considered sacred, it's been the site of hundreds of deaths over the years. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, pilgrims were already journeying to Amarnath, but they lacked the knowledge and technology of today. In 1928, a pair of scholars noted that roughly 600 people died trying to enter Amarnath. These unlucky adventurers succumbed to bacterial infections or by exposure to the elements. Even though they weren't trapped, they were days away from civilization at a time when medicine wasn't even close to what we have today. Amarnath's death toll has slowed down, but it continues to claim more lives almost every year. Amarnath is located in the Kashmir and Jammu regions of India, and legislators in these areas put extra effort into safety of this year's Amarnath Yatra. Massive tent encampments were set up by government officials ahead of time to give pilgrims enough shelter and rest along the way. They set up 8 of these camps along the route to Amarnath. They made a small 100-bed hospital in a nearby town to account for any lingering effects of the pandemic, and 25 communication towers were built along the route that transmitted cell phone service to the remote mountain pass, allowing officials to provide weather reports to the pilgrims. A diversion wall was also erected to prevent floods inside the cave from overflowing into the valley. Amit Shah, Union Home Minister of India, even completed an inspection to go the extra mile. This year, the Indian government took the yatra more seriously than ever before, with many steps to ensure the safety of the travelers. However, all of their efforts were in vain because Mother Nature is unstoppable. On July 8th, 2022, pilgrims were slowly and silently entering the huge earthen canopy of Amarnath when the sky outside suddenly darkened. The sound of rain came first. The sudden roar of a storm broke the silence as the view from the entrance became blocked by walls of rain. Inside, water levels began to rise, but visitors were mostly safe because the sheer size of the main chamber of the cave makes it difficult to flood. Chaos erupted in the silent zone of the cave as people saw what was happening outside: a flood. Amarnath's water had spilled out in a different path and was heading straight for the thousands of people in the Litter Valley. Thousands of people outside Amarnath were caught in a cloudburst. Even normal amounts of rain can quickly turn into deadly floods deep within the small confines of caves. But this flood burst through outside of the cave. Normally, rain clouds reach a critical point where they begin to lose water. But when clouds meet fast-moving, very hot air currents, the normal rainfall process gets disrupted. In what's known as orographic lift, instead of moisture freely flowing down as rain, the warm front creates a barrier, blocking the rain from falling. The clouds rise in altitude, allowing more time for condensation to build up more rain. And when the warm front loses momentum or cools down, the floodgates are unleashed. The sheer mountainside created the perfect place for this orographic lift to occur, right along the path the pilgrims were traveling. Normal rainfall dumps a lot of water, roughly 20,000 tons per square mile, but the precipitation rate is often slow and predictable. Cloudbursts can suddenly dump up to 65,600 tons of water per square mile of land, nearly 3 times as much rain as a regular rainstorm in much less time. Along with all the other preparations for the yatras, the irrigation and flood control departments constructed a boundary wall in case of flooding within the cave. This wall should have stopped any flooding from reaching the pilgrims, but even the best couldn't predict this flood. It only took moments for the flood to break through the diversion wall and sweep through Amarnath and down the mountainside. A full river of water came barreling toward the pilgrims, who were now mostly lined up along a walkway. Years of devotion by millions of people formed the perfect path of least resistance for the flood as it swept through nearly the whole ranks of the pilgrimage. Those lucky few who were further down managed to walk up the sheer sides of the mountain as best as they could. But the rocky elevated portions of the mountain were far away from the pathway, and the dirt and rock became slippery as the path started to break down and send chunks of rock and dirt crashing down to the tent city below. With a terrifying crack, the sudden loss of dirt dislodged huge boulders that came tumbling down the mountain as all hope ran out. The sudden flood cut off the Amarnath entrance from the valley, stranding over 15,000 people inside or right at the mouth of the cave. Hundreds of personnel from the National Disaster Response Force were deployed from the base camp, while 2 additional teams were dispatched via helicopter along with other emergency personnel and first responders. Along the route, 25 tents were swept away in the deluge. 3 mobile kitchens that were set up to feed the pilgrims were also demolished as the mudslide charged through the encampment. The people near the entrance of the cave were caught instantly, but the people in the camp had a few moments to react. They grabbed what they could and abandoned their tents, seeking higher ground. Once the cloudburst subsided, rescue teams started digging through the mud for bodies. Others began picking through the chaos to find their belongings, or whatever was left of them. 65 more people were stranded outside as a river of mud split the camp. Crews managed to pull 2 survivors out from the mud, while still more were buried or sent careening down the mountain. Normally, cave rescuers are trying to save 1 or maybe a handful of lives. These operations can deploy hundreds of people to dig through rock and ensure the safest route for trapped explorers. Injured cavers are placed on special stretchers, secured, and sometimes given drugs to help ease their suffering during the hours-long exit from caves. But this situation was stretched thin and far more chaotic. Crews couldn't take all the same precautions because they weren't dealing with a handful of lives. They had to save thousands. Injured people, still bleeding and broken, were sent on basic canvas stretchers to helicopters. Upon landing, doctors rushed to assess patients and start treatment. Afterward, beneath a heavy gray sky as people somberly huddled together to mourn, dog squads came searching for bodies, and crews used thermal imaging devices to search for people trapped under the mud. The governments of Jammu and Kashmir set up a helpline for families worried about the status of their loved ones. In total, 16 people died in the moments after the cloudburst, while over 20 were injured, and 40 more went missing. Some sources later said that the total rainfall ended up being less than the threshold for a cloudburst. But if that wasn't a cloudburst, it's hard to imagine how horrible the event could have been. If the diversion wall wasn't built, it's likely the death toll would have been over 10 times as disastrous. The Indian government quickly shut down travel to Amarnath during the rescue operation, but after only 3 days, with blood still soaked into the muddy soil, the pilgrimage resumed as thousands more journeyed into the icy depths of Amarnath. This insane natural disaster is sadly all too common in India. The unique terrain of the Himalayas has made India the country with the most cloudbursts on Earth, more than double of Pakistan, which has the second most cloudbursts. This wasn't the first time a cloudburst wiped out life at Amarnath. In 1969, another huge storm killed 40 people, much like what happened this year. 3 more people died and 11 were injured when another cloudburst swept through the crowds in 2015. This time, the tragedy sparked renewed interest into creating safety nets for the pilgrims, who were ultimately inexperienced regular people trying to take on dangerous spelunking in one of the most unique and unforgiving climates. Some have called for improvements to weather forecasting, additional satellite warnings, and even cave warning systems similar to those used to save people from flash flooding inside of caves. In the wake of the Amarnath cave disaster, the Surveyor Director General of India finally contracted cavers to explore the depths of Amarnath and map out the cave's hidden interiors. The team used digital contour mapping to get accurate readouts of the depths of Amarnath. DCM is another name for LiDAR, or Laser Imaging, Detection, and Ranging, a technique that uses lasers to measure the surface details of the rock. If future explorers can find the source of the water, they can build a diversion path so that future cave flooding will exit away from the entrance. Over 50% of the project was completed by September 12th, but additional information has been sparse since the cave is a holy site. The interior of Amarnath Cave isn't as deadly as many of the other notorious caves, but that hasn't stopped it from causing more death than any other. On top of dealing with sudden floods that can wipe away thousands of travelers in an instant, pilgrims to the Amarnath Cave have had to face a different kind of enemy that most cavers have never planned for: other people. India and the surrounding countries have been locked in culture wars for some time, and this clash has spilled over into Amarnath. Some extremists have taken up arms against the pilgrims, and over the years, these militia units have committed terror attacks, violently killing a number of pilgrims. The incidences began back in 1994, when terror groups started threatening the pilgrims, but the groups continued to journey in peace until the year 2000. That year, at the end of the Yatra journey, armed militias swarmed the base camp near the mountain, killing 28 armed civilians and 3 officers. The groups killed indiscriminately, targeting members of every faith. A year later, An extremist threw a grenade near the cave's entrance, killing 13 people and injuring 15 more. Armed guards returned fire as pilgrims fled both into the cave and down the narrow walkways leading into the valley. In the chaos, more people were killed until eventually security forces subdued the attacker and shut down the yatra. The remaining pilgrims were escorted out, flanked by soldiers, while the injured were airlifted to makeshift hospitals. In total, 13 people died and 15 more were injured. The bloodbath continued the following year in 2002 when 2 more massacres struck Amarnath. In a coordinated attack, one group of militants targeted the cave entrance, killing 2 people and injuring 3 more, while a second group struck a base camp, killing 9 and wounding 27. This time, the cave entrance was more heavily guarded, and people funneling into the cave were protected by Amarnath's massive limestone walls, which saved countless lives. But the base camp was left exposed. Over a decade later, in 2017, Amarnath descended into chaos once again when extremists from Pakistan gunned down 8 more people. Other incidents included a car crash that struck a roadside kitchen that was giving away free meals to the pilgrims. This crash killed 12 people back in 2012. That same year, 117 more people died from exposure or other accidents. In 2017, another accident befell a bus carrying pilgrims who couldn't make the whole trip on foot. The bus tumbled off the road and fell 150 feet into the gorge below, killing 16 passengers instantly, and the remaining 2 died of complications in the hospital. Amarnath Cave in India is a holy site, but it's also been the cause of more deaths than any other cave in history. Much of the interior of the cave remains shrouded in mystery. How many more lives will Amarnath claim in the years to come? And how many could be saved if cavers could finally map the interior of this legendary cave? In 2008, a caving couple entered New Zealand's Lucky Strike Cave. Nearly an hour into their journey, one of the cavers, a 32-year-old woman, stopped for a moment to rest near a gorgeous waterfall. Suddenly, catastrophe struck and she suffered serious injuries. Her male counterpart was forced to make the agonizing choice: stay with her until help arrives, or leave her alone in the darkness to go get help. Find out what he chose and if his partner survived in the Lucky Strike Cave rescue. Caving has been a popular hobby and tourist activity ever since the New Zealand Speleological Society was founded back in 1949. Hundreds of thousands of people travel to New Zealand to explore the caves, with the majority of visitors traveling to the Waitomo district, where hundreds of caves extend deep into the earth. The name Waitomo comes from the local Maori language, which roughly translates to water flowing through sinkholes. Waitomo tunnels, like the glowworm caves, are world famous for their populations of Arachnocampa luminisa, unique glowworms found only in New Zealand. While many of these caves are tourist attractions for non-cavers, some caves give real spelunkers a run for their money. Today's story takes place in Lucky Strike Cave, considered one of the toughest caves in the country. Lucky Strike is owned privately by the Chandler family, though they do allow experienced cavers to explore its dark reaches. It takes pro cavers 3 to 4 hours to reach the back end of Lucky Strike, and that's only if they're skilled enough to make it all the way through. Recently, cavers Mike Allen and Dave Ellicott tried to explore Lucky Strike to find a connection between its end and the Junior Mudball cave system. Jane Furkett and her partner got permission to explore the cave together. They thought they had been through everything caves could throw at them, so they were prepared and physically fit for the sporty challenge. Soon after entering, the pair found a long, narrow room with hundreds of straws, needles of calcium carbonate or sulfate dripping mineral water from the ceiling. Unlike regular stalactites, these straws are hollow, which makes them far more fragile. These delicate formations take thousands of years to develop, but a gentle poke will send them crashing down to the floor. The pair crouched through the section, ducking just under the straws. Beyond this area, Lucky Strike requires cavers to spread their legs across a jagged crack and almost jump from side to side to move across the chasm. Other areas require cavers to push their feet and hands against two walls and move forward across the gap. This technique is known as bridging, and both of these dangerous sections are usually done without ropes, so one wrong move could easily lead to certain death. Luckily, the ground here is usually dry. The lights of their headlamps moved across glistening speleoforms, casting warped shadows along the cave walls. Haunted by the sound of dripping water and the eerie stillness of the cave, the two spelunkers tied themselves together to traverse undulating sections of smooth stone. The rope gave them some stability and security in case one fell, and they needed to have the rope ready for the next area. The next pitch opened high above the previous area. To get across safely, they attached their gear bags to a rope and pushed it across the large chasm. Then they attached their own harnesses and zip-lined across to the other side. From there, they would abseil up the rock face. This technique is like the climbing version of rappelling. This technique uses a double rope affixed to a high point in case they slip and fall. Near the end of the cave, they'd have to dig their way through mud and rock to push through narrow tunnels to the exit. There, water levels can easily push into the face of cavers while rocks stab into their sides. The area here is very similar to the atmosphere of the nearby Junior Cave with its thick and endless tunnels of mud. However, these two cavers wouldn't make it that far. Beyond a large, slanted room full of boulders, Lucky Strike opens into a riverbed. To explore the end of the cave, the two had to walk against the flow of the water while a steady shower drips from overhead along the pathway. To overcome faster flowing sections, cavers affixed a rope along the side of the river. This connects to a thin bridge of rounded stone that leads upward. By now, the cold was getting severe. The ceaseless flow of water constricted their fingers. Their torsos went rigid as blood flow diverted to their central organs and their muscles tightened. Furkett was climbing up the side of the riverbed chamber when she reached a small ledge. She unhooked a traverse line that connected to the next section to take a break. Big mistake. Her foot gave way. The rope quickly tethered as her weight suddenly dropped into her harness. Her fingers, still numb and wet from the cold, damp chamber, couldn't grip the rope that was moving with the force of her entire body. The rope slid from her hands, whipping through the anchors as she tumbled backwards. Her legs shot up toward the ceiling, and her body instinctively bent forward, trying to grab the rope. She saw the wall blur past as her vision moved to the ceiling. As her arms hung in the air, she had no time to scream. She landed on her bottom at the floor of Lucky Strike Cave. Jane's partner called to her above the sound of the rushing water. He got to her as fast as he could. She was still conscious and groaning in pain. One of her hands instinctively went to her side, and the other covered her mouth. As the man approached her, his lamp cast a grim light onto her face. She had fallen nearly 30 feet down, and her hand was dripping with blood that looked almost orange as the yellow light reflected back into his eyes. He asked if she was all right, and she spat thick globs of blood as she tried to respond. The pain kept her from speaking full sentences. She tried to respond in gasps, and as she spoke, he saw some of her teeth had shattered. Some broken teeth were lodged in her gums, while the stumps of others leaked blood, like the hollow straws near the cave's entrance. Her head was on fire with pain, but this injury wasn't bad enough to keep her stuck here. She wasn't even focused on the blood or the pain from her teeth when she spoke. Instead, she muttered that her hip was in pain. The other caver tried to gently touch her side to see if he could pinpoint where the pain was and what was wrong. She jerked away. The amount of pain Verkett was experiencing could only mean one thing. Her hip had been shattered by the fall. The waters of Lucky Strike continued to slam into them both. Realizing the cold river would quickly overtake them, he told her that she would have to brace herself. He raised her upper body as best as he could, and slowly dragged her down the river. She slipped from his grasp, and he stumbled to catch her. His ankle nearly twisted from the sudden maneuver over the top of smooth, wet rocks of the riverbed. Jane nearly hyperventilated to prevent herself from screaming in pain as it seared through her whole body. Miraculously, her fellow caver pulled her from the water to a drier section of the cave, but the waters would still pose a threat. As adrenaline gripped her body, she wouldn't be able to notice her own body temperature. The adrenaline constricted her blood vessels and sped up her heart rate, making hypothermia more likely to claim her fingers and toes, and eventually her life. The other caver knelt by her side. He reached for first aid, but he fumbled with the gauze as his thoughts raced. To prevent her from freezing, he wrapped their survival blanket around her. She tried to grab it, but her bloodied hands caused it to slip from her grasp. He tried to be noble and told her he wouldn't leave her, they'd make it out together. As time passed by, her shock continued to get worse. She told him that staying here would be the death of them both. He had to go get help. Now. Hesitant to leave her behind, he took off most of his extra equipment and rushed back through the boulder chamber and across the bridging gap. He stumbled through the cave straws, not caring about anything other than saving her life. He had to get out of the cave. Once outside, he contacted emergency rescue crews. Police, search and rescue volunteers, ambulance medics from the nearby St. John, and caving experts all arrived to lend their aid. In total, 25 people came to Jane's aid. Rescuers knew Lucky Strike was a difficult cave. They needed a stretcher with a body harness to keep her secure during the long ride out of the cave. These stretchers have a solid plate to provide stability, along with long sides and flaps for the head and feet. They use colored straps so rescuers can easily connect them in the dark without mixing up the order, which would cause the stretcher to dump the injured caver to their death. The mostly enclosed stretcher would allow the team to lift Jane at angles and around tight corners. The cave entrance was a 20-minute drive from the nearby town along narrow country roads, but slowly, rescuers lined the roads as they congregated at the mouth of the cave. The rescuers split into teams and stormed into the cave. The fall happened around 2:30 p.m., and nearly 4 hours later, the first rescue crew was still trying to progress through Lucky Strike. Their progress was slowed because some of the rescuers needed to move carefully and slowly while rigging a haul system for the stretcher. The river wasn't a straight path. It had twists that got narrower over time, and it had waterfalls. Usually, cavers would use the ropes to climb around the waterfalls, but rescuers would need to make a straight pathway through the raging waters. As rescuers continued to create an exit path for Jane, another volunteer from the Auckland Westpac Rescue Helicopter Trust pushed on ahead alone into Lucky Strike. This rescuer was not only a skilled caver, but also an advanced paramedic with tons of experience in high-pressure situations. They knew that the rigging lines were vital to the saving of Jane's life, but the paramedic knew that Jane needed immediate medical attention or the ropes would be useless. The paramedic arrived at Furkett's location hours before the rest of the crew and found Jane was still alive, but her soaked clothes were causing her to lose body heat fast. Her hip injury wasn't life-threatening. Instead, hypothermia was her greatest enemy. The paramedic stabilized her leg and torso to prevent further damage to her bones and to reduce the nerve pain that was crippling her where she lay. Meanwhile, lines were rigged high above the ground in many places to give the stretcher enough room to dip around the corners and avoid the hazards below. They loaded her into the bright orange cocoon. Her stretcher swayed perilously above the dark abyss, far further than her earlier fall. Her fate rested in the skills of the rescuers who had quickly anchored the pulleys and ropes just hours earlier. Wriggling or jerky movements in the stretcher could cause anchors to dislodge. It could cause rescuers to drop her, or sudden movements could throw them all off their pathway and send them all crashing to their own deaths. To avoid her accidentally wrecking the rescue plan, they administered painkillers to dull the brutal pain that radiated through her core. At 1:30 a.m., Nearly 12 hours after her painful ordeal started, Jane was finally freed from the grasp of Lucky Strike Cave. The awaiting ambulance drove her out of the forest into the nearby town, where a helicopter took her to the Waikato Hospital. Once there, she was treated for hypothermia, and her condition stabilized. Rescuers said this was one of the most challenging rescue operations in New Zealand's history, thanks to the physically demanding nature of Lucky Strike and the complicated pathway of the rigging line. This difficult cave continues to attract cavers, but only the bravest and most adept cavers should even consider risking their lives beyond the straws, the gaps, and the waterfalls hidden deep below ground in Lucky Strike Cave. The cave known as Harwood's Hole captivated explorers from the moment they first peered into its shadowy depths. Spelunkers wagered it could be the deepest cave in New Zealand. Scientists and cavers gathered from far and wide to figure out how to enter this strange vertical chasm in the earth. Peter Lambert spearheaded the mission to explore Harwood's Hole, until his ambition became his demise. Join us as we venture into the depths of this cave and uncover one of the earliest tragedies in the history of New Zealand caving. Harwood's Hole Cave is a huge void in the earth below the Abel Tasman National Park on the South Island of New Zealand. The park, named for the first European explorer to discover New Zealand, covers a decent area of 91.5 square miles of lush forest-covered hills, sandy beaches, waterfalls, and rope bridges. The bulk of the park's terrain is comprised of the Takaka Hill Range. These mountainous hills were used to film multiple locations in the Lord of the Rings movies, including the Chetwood Forest near the Shire and Dimrail Dale beyond the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. These hills are made from a prized mineral, crystallized limestone, otherwise known as marble. In the past, quarries blasted apart sections of the rocky terrain to mine the marble and limestone, but now Takaka Hill is part of the park's nature preserve. The vast limestone deposits in the region made the perfect place for caves to form. Instead of long caves slowly winding downward, the caves of Takaka Hill form a patchwork of sinkholes that cut down into the hills. These deep pits feed the Takaka River that snakes through the caves below, and their entrances have been traps for unsuspecting animals for thousands of years. Below these caves, explorers found large deposits of perfectly preserved moa bones and other strange oddities. 30 of New Zealand's deepest caves tunnel down below Takaka Hill, including Harwood's. The Harwood Pit is over 1,000 feet deep with a massive 160-foot opening. Harwood's was first uncovered by a farmer named Henry Harwood, who owned land on the Takaka Hill Range. Once he unearthed the cave, Henry was too frightened to explore it. But a man named Peter Lambert was ready for the challenge. Roughly 10 years before the first Harwood expedition, Peter's relative, Henry Lambert, started the New Zealand Speleological Society, so caving was in Peter's blood. In 1957, Peter Lambert and his fellow cavers from the North Island went across the bay to explore new caves. They met the farmers in the area, and the farmers brought the spelunkers to Harwood's Cave. This sparked a chain of events that was ultimately responsible for creating the caving community in New Zealand. In 1958, a year after cavers first heard of Harwood's, a team of cavers, including Dave Kershaw, Catherine Donald, Malcolm Laird, and Peter Lambert, undertook the first exploration of the cave. It was Christmas Day, but these young adults wanted a world-first experience instead of presents. As they peered down into the cave, they realized the walls weren't perfectly straight. Instead, the cave had multiple outcroppings, almost like the neck of a vase. They couldn't simply rig ropes because technology was lacking back then. The single rope technique, or SRT, had only recently been developed by climbers exploring the Alps. To make SRT work, cavers needed new inventions like assisted braking descending devices such as the Petzl Stop, low stretch mantle ropes, new harnesses, and new climbing techniques like the frog sit-stand climb. Ladders were also a no-go. They were dangerous beyond 200 feet, and it was clear that this cave was much deeper. The cavers used their ingenuity to overcome Harwood's strange formations. French caver Pierre Lebon crafted his own winch to deal with similar caves in different areas. Pierre's design worked for a while, and many cavers, including Lambert's team, based their own winches off his design. However, Pierre's winch failed him in the Saint-Nathan cave and he fell to his death. New Zealand caver and engineer Richard Scott created a new winch so his team could explore Harwood's Hole cave. On the day of the adventure, the team clambered around the entrance of the cave. One of the cavers threw a rock down the mouth of the cave. They waited. It took almost 10 seconds for the stone's dry thud to bounce back up the cave. It was a long way down. Dave Kershaw attached a parachute harness to his back, attached it onto the load hook of the winch, and his friends lowered him down into the cave. The crank slowly turned the winch's drum, and the looped cable unraveled with a rusty creak as Dave inched down into the darkness. The boys above shouted down to the brave caver, but their voices grew thin as the cave went deeper into the unknown. After an eternity of tension, the first caver touched ground in Harwood's cave. This first exploration only went 600 feet down to the first ledge, but it was still a monumental achievement. The next day, Malcolm, Catherine, and Peter Lambert rode the winch down into the darkness. They found a chamber so massive that their primitive headlamps couldn't even reach the walls from one side to the next. As they walked, the floor became a steep ramp descending further down, and it was riddled with pebbles. One slip could dislodge an avalanche of stone and send the cavers sliding to their doom. No matter how much preparation cavers make, a cave-in or rock slide is practically unstoppable. Cavers can only suppress their fears and ignore the ever-present danger. They continued along a horizontal portion of the cave until they reached an underground lake. On this rocky shore, enclosed in cold stone, Lambert and his crew camped for the night. After they got some shut-eye, they climbed back to the first Avon and asked the two cavers above ground to send a log down with the winch. They heaved the wood down the steep slope and over to the lake for use as a rudimentary bridge. The room beyond was a gorgeous display of speleoforms, rimstone pools, and a feature known as the Twin Waterfalls. After exploring more passages, they reached a sump, a flooded U-shaped tunnel. Back then, cave diving was also in its infancy, and the team wasn't ready to risk their lives in the unknown depths of the flooded section. With no way to travel further, Lambert's team concluded their first exploration into Harwood's Hole cave. The next year, Lambert would return to determine if the cave had any connections to other cave systems or if it had other entrances. Word spread like wildfire about the wonders of Harwood, and this time, 21 cavers came to the expedition. On the day of the fated expedition, they once again slowly lowered one another down the pit. To determine new routes or connections, they had to trace the flow of the subterranean river. They used fluorescent dye at the stream near the sump. A second team found the dye in a resurgence above ground, and then they used dynamite to blow open the above-ground creek. This second team of cavers lit the flames of their carbide lanterns and crawled into the darkness. After a long trek, they saw familiar lights ahead. They found the connection they were looking for and emerged near the first campground called the Boudoir. The team named this new region the Starlight Cave, and it proved Harwood was a full system of caves. This second expedition explored nearly 3,000 feet of additional side passages and squirming tunnels in Harwoods. With their mission complete, the cavers signaled to the team at the winch, but they were still excited from their discovery. One by one, they were lifted from the cave. Remember, this winch was initially designed for the first mission to explore Harwoods. There were only 5 cavers for that trip, and they only planned to use it for a few days. But the team kept using it for future expeditions, including this one. The sheer number of cavers in this second expedition put significant strain on the device. The clunky motor that helped crank the winch began puttering with plumes of thick exhaust as it lifted the cavers from the abyss. The winch drum squeaked an ear-piercing sound, causing some of the cavers to wince and duck away from the noise, but when they looked back, the winch was fine. It kept slowly turning and raising the cavers up the hole. They regularly checked the cable for any signs of damage, and after the first caving winch pioneer died, they also kept tabs on the harnesses and the hooks that held the harness and the cable together. They did everything by the book, but they forgot one important detail. As nightfall fell over the camp, the team decided to stay for 2 more days. They put the machine and the bodies to work crawling, climbing, and digging through the stone and mud. After the 2-day extension was finished, the cavers were ready to wrap up their adventure. One by one, the cavers took the slow ride up the pothole. Peter Reed and Peter Diamond were up top ready to help the next caver up the final cliff. They would keep an eye on the ascending cavers to ensure that nothing went wrong. Down below, Les Kermode was up next. Now, no one's exactly sure why, but Peter Lampert approached Kermode just moments before he was about to signal for the team to begin lifting him out. Kermode was hooked up and ready to go, but Lampert asked to switch with him. Kermode respected Lambert's seniority. Without Lambert's team, none of them would be there making history. Kermode stepped back and traded places with Lambert. Lambert attached his harness to the winch, and the machine's squeaky wheels began to turn. Lampert was a few hundred feet off the ground when disaster struck. The winch had been anchored to the rock in multiple points with large bolts and screws. Despite the machine working outside of its intended operating conditions, it performed just fine. However, the vibrations of the winch and its roaring motor channeled through the mounting hardware into the anchors and into the weathered rock. The continuous shaking of the motor and the device caused massive boulders to dislodge from the cliff at the Harwood's Hole entrance. It happened so fast, none of the ledge team could do anything to stop the onslaught. Lampert heard the sounds and looked up, but he was hanging helplessly above the abyss. The boulders tumbled down into the cave and impacted him. The team below ground barely had time to react. They heard the sounds, and they had only a few split seconds to duck out of the way. After the rock slide settled down, they returned to the beam of light streaming down overhead as Lampert's blood dripped onto their helmets from above. The team called to Lampert, but he had no response. His limbs were limp in his harness, and his head hung low as the winch continued its slow, methodical ascent. The team tried to crank the speed of the winch faster, desperately pulling Lampert to the ledge. After what felt like forever, the team got Lampert onto the ledge. He was still unconscious. His injuries were gruesome, but he was alive. The cavers tended to him as best as they could with their outdated medical training and technology. Since caving was just beginning in New Zealand, there was no on-call rescue team to save him. Some of the cavers ran to get help as fast as they could. Help arrived, but not in time. Peter Lampert, the pioneer who ignited the caving community's passion, died from the blunt force trauma of the rock slide. Down near the campsite, the cavers who were still inside the vertical cave piled rocks like the humans of ancient times. They built a cairn in Lampert's honor, which is still there today. Since the winch was unsafe, they took the long trek through the new connection in starlight. The cavers completed the shrine by placing Lambert's helmet on top of the cairn, and they exited the Harwood's Hole cave to rejoin the world above ground. His team was determined to make sure that Lambert didn't die in vain. They returned and proved that Harwood's Hole was the deepest cave in the country, dethroning the previous record holder. Eventually, Ellis Basin in the Nettlebit system was found to be deeper than even Harwood's, but Lampert's trailblazing adventure and his tragic demise united New Zealand cavers. Together, they formed more caving groups and rescue teams to spread their love of the underworld hidden inside caves. Sometimes even tragic tales have inspiring ends. On this channel, we've covered some of the most harrowing tales from some of the most intimidating dive sites around the world. Now, some of you viewers may have wondered, which is the deadliest? Is there one diving location that's more dangerous, more terrifying, more unbelievable than all the rest? The answer is yes. There is one particular dive site with more fatalities to its name than any other. More astonishing than that, no one knows for sure exactly why. Over the years, this mysterious and lethal site has witnessed some very newsworthy accidents, including the deaths of famous divers. But while the international community may be familiar with some of these isolated, high-profile stories, the locals, especially the local rescue teams, are desperate to alert the public about the larger picture. This is the larger picture. This is the incredible history and enduring mystery of Egypt's Blue Hole. To visit the deadliest dive site in the world, you have to travel to a remote region of Egypt on the country's southeastern coast. Even today, there are still only a few major roads that will take you all the way out there, and only one small airport. Along the way, for hundreds of miles, you will see almost nothing but desert. In a country with more than 100 million people living in it, this entire 23,000 square mile region only has about 600,000 of them. If you choose to drive from Cairo, it'll take you about 6.5 hours, but if you do, eventually you'll reach the small coastal town of Dahab. Historically, the first people to arrive here were the Bedouins, Arabic-speaking nomadic people who have long lived in the deserts of the Middle East. With the dramatic Sinai Mountains perched behind them and the calm waters of the Red Sea at their feet, Dahab once served as an idyllic fishing village for generations of Bedouins. However, had these Bedouins been able to fly drones or board helicopters many generations ago, they would have almost immediately noticed something very unusual about their beloved fishing town. It has a hole in it. The jagged, rocky slopes of the Sinai Mountains descend partway below the surface of the Red Sea, but then jut back inward dramatically at one specific point in the coastline. It is at this particular point where, underneath the water, a massive depression sits in the flesh of the earth. Early Bedouins can certainly be forgiven for not knowing the full extent of what was hidden just beneath them. After all, the depression is an example of a strange geological phenomena that nobody fully recognized until at least the latter half of the 20th century. It is, in fact, a submarine sinkhole. It wasn't until recent decades that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration began working alongside recreational divers and fishermen who had been saying for years that they were finding huge underwater sinkholes in various parts of the world. Even today, the NOAA, or NOAA, is still unraveling the mystery of what the Blue Hole and other sinkholes like it actually are, or how they come to exist. Their current theory is that they are similar to sinkholes on land, but they're simply located underwater. The organization admits that much is still to be learned. It is still completely unknown how many of these submarine sinkholes exist, or where they may be located around the world. The full extent of the submarine sinkhole off the coast of Dahab wasn't widely known until the late 1960s. That's because in June of 1967, war broke out between Israel and the Arab countries of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. The war was remarkably short, known to historians today as the Six-Day War. But in that short time, Israel managed to capture a swath of territory, including the Sinai Peninsula, and also uncover what many today consider the most beautiful and enchanting dive site on Earth. The Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula would last for another 15 years. In 1982, the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty was officially implemented, and Egypt finally established diplomatic relations with Israel. During the 15-year military occupation, however, the submarine sinkhole off the coast of Dahab was explored by Israeli dive teams. Right away, for the first time, the world finally awakened to the extraordinary diving location that the Blue Hole of Dahab truly is. So what makes it so extraordinary? Well, for starters, Unlike many dive sites, the Blue Hole is easily accessible right from the beach. You need only wade out a few meters into the water, and you're there, close enough to remain in earshot of the people still sunning on the shore. Knee-deep in calm water, take just one step forward, and it's a 400-plus foot drop. However, this is not the way divers actually do it. The proper way to enter is from the opposite side. The entrance to the Blue Hole is up the coastline, about 200 meters away. The next thing that makes the Blue Hole so unique is what you find once you enter. What looks initially like an unassuming drop-off into shallow water becomes, after just a few feet of swimming, an open void. It doesn't matter how clean or clear your diving goggles are, you cannot see the bottom. The beginning of the diving route takes you along what is best described as an underwater canyon. Huge rocky walls surround you on either side. Below, the walls descend deeper and deeper, eventually vanishing into the blue nothingness underneath. This wide avenue leads the way forward. The bottom remains so far below as to be completely out of sight the entire time. The height is actually so intense that it's common for divers to get vertigo. Floating in space, hundreds of feet above a perilous drop, the human body and mind have only one natural instinct in this situation. Yet, for those who can withstand the gut-wrenching environment, it can be the thrill of a lifetime. But the most astonishing part of this one-of-a-kind dive site is still to come. Eventually, as intrepid divers swim their way further and further, they see, growing in the distance, something that seems almost too mystical to be real. A bluish glow, as if there is a faint light source sitting at the bottom of the ocean. As you get closer, the bluish glow soon becomes undeniable. It grows larger and brighter until it dominates your field of vision. What this supernatural entity really turns out to be is a massive archway leading into the Blue Hole itself. From up at the surface, almost like the pupil of some massive eye looking out towards the sun, daylight pours down through the thin layer of seawater and floods down through the chasm of the Blue Hole. Recreational divers who have swum this far have already been flirting with the limit of what is considered a safe depth. Now, perhaps more than 100 feet below the surface, they must contend with the fact that this glowing archway is still way, way below them. Those who have seen the archway in person all share the belief that there is something almost magically alluring about it. Upon his visit to the site, the excellent diver and TV presenter Monty Halls noted that when you first come upon it, the archway looks easy to pass through, as if the open chamber of the Blue Hole is inches away on the other side. In reality, the archway is nearly 100 feet across. The blue light is so intense that it shines out across even that long distance, creating the illusion that it is much shorter than it really is. After descending to a depth of over 400 feet and passing through this incredible archway, divers rise through the glowing vertical tunnel and emerge back into daylight at the main opening of the Blue Hole. The entire dive, from start to finish, carries you a mere 250 meters along the shoreline. And while undeniably one of the most uniquely beautiful sights in the world, it is also unusually simple and straightforward. In fact, some in the technical diving community have made the claim that the Blue Hole should be one of the safest dive sites in the world. But it isn't. The rocky outcroppings near the entrance are littered with signs. Little makeshift tombstones with name after name after name after name. In fact, the total death count is unconfirmed, but ask a local Bedouin diver named Tariq Omar, who has been conducting body recoveries at the Blue Hole for decades, and he'll tell you that well over 100 people have died in the Blue Hole. Some divers familiar with the area even estimate as many as 200. This means the Blue Hole is by far the most lethal diving site on Earth. No cursed Mexican cenote nor dizzying Florida sinkhole even comes close to the rate of death that this wide, straight 250-meter stretch of Egyptian coastline somehow has. In fact, based on records kept by the International Underwater Cave Rescue and Recovery, the entire state of Florida, arguably the mecca of extreme underwater diving sites, has roughly the same yearly death toll as the Blue Hole on its own. Imagine one small stretch of highway out in the middle of nowhere causing as many accidents as every Formula One racetrack combined. Or imagine one small town restaurant where more people get sick than every restaurant in a nearby city combined. Clearly, something out of the ordinary has to be going on. There is something freakish beneath the surface of the Blue Hole of Denab, and it's killing divers of all skill levels at a rate that is beyond abnormal. So, what is it? The people of Dahab have a local legend to explain the sensational killing capacity of the site. The legend states that long ago, there was a young woman who lived on the coast of Dahab named Shaheen. Shaheen had fallen in love with a local boy, but their love was forbidden by their parents. Against her will, Shaheen was engaged to be married to another man, a man who she didn't love. Way back then, the opening to the Blue Hole was not yet submerged by the sea. In despair, the young Shaheen threw herself over the edge, falling to her death. According to local legend, the Blue Hole is now haunted by Shaheen's restless spirit. With the enticing glow of the archway hundreds of feet below, the broken-hearted Shaheen lures young men to her, hypnotizing them before taking their souls into the next world. It's a stirring fable, and perhaps one that has more than a hint of truth behind it. But surely there has to be more to it than that. Well, as we're about to see, the history of deaths at this site is nothing short of unbelievable. So, without further ado, let's take a closer look at some of the people who have met their doom in the Blue Hole. Perhaps their stories can help shed some light on the true nature of this mind-bending phenomena. In November of 1997, two experienced divers from Ireland were in Dahab diving with the Paddy Diving School. They were 22-year-old Martin Guerra and 23-year-old Conor O'Regan. According to a report by the Irish Times, O'Regan had previous experience not only diving, but specifically with diving in the Red Sea. His fellow diver Guerra was a diving instructor who had been living in Egypt for the past year. On Wednesday, November 19, 1997, local diver Tarek Omar got the call he had been fearing he would get ever since he started working as an instructor in the area 2 years prior. Martin Guerra and Conor O'Regan had entered the Blue Hole together and had failed to resurface. Steeling his resolve, Omar dove into the Blue Hole to look for the missing pair. What he ended up finding would leave a permanent mark on his memory. The two Irishmen were resting in a ditch about 335 feet below the surface. Both had drowned, and yet their bodies remained locked in a haunting embrace, almost two corpses dancing. Omar later speculated that one had been sinking and the other had been trying to pull them back up when the pair both eventually drowned. But which of the pair had first begun sinking, and why? Their names are among the many that line the rock wall near the entrance, ensuring that even today, their tragic deaths will at the very least be remembered. But understood or explained? Not so much. Nearly a decade earlier, before Tarek Omar had moved to Dahab and earned himself the nickname Bone Collector, another pair of divers had met a similar fate. Daniel Malak and Tarek El-Khadi both drowned in the Blue Hole on the same day in 1988. Tarek Omar had very little time to dwell on the past, however. Within a couple of years of his first grisly recovery mission, he found himself at the forefront of what would become the Blue Hole's most famous death. In April of the year 2000, 22-year-old Russian-Israeli diving instructor Yuri Lipsky had been itching to dive the Blue Hole for at least a year prior. On that fateful day, witnesses say they saw Lipsky entering the water off the coast of Dahab with two very important things missing: a diving buddy and an extra oxygen tank. Lipsky's motivations for diving alone and with only one oxygen tank remain controversial to this day. But amazingly, one thing we do know he had with him that day was a video camera. The last anybody saw him alive, Lipsky was walking up the coast in his diving gear. When he failed to resurface, word spread quickly. Within a day, Lipsky's father had traveled from Russia to Dahab to look for his son. The man was reportedly all but ready to dive into the hole himself and had to be talked out of it by locals. Once again, the task of searching the blue hole fell to Tarek Omar. The search for Yuri Lipsky was unusual, in that Lipsky had been diving alone, and no one knew how far into the hole he had actually made it. The only way to find out was to conduct a thorough search. Lipsky's body was eventually found at 115 meters below the surface, nearly 3 times the depth considered safe for recreational divers. But Lipsky was no amateur. The 22-year-old was in fact a diving instructor. So why, millions soon wondered, did the video captured by his camera show him descending at a rapid rate towards his own demise? The roughly 7-minute video went on to make Lipsky's death one of the most famous in diving history. It was as disturbing as it was mysterious. Tarek Omar would later offer the theory that Lipsky was weighed down and that his camera may have tipped the scales. However, this explanation alone hasn't been enough to stop the internet from proliferating various theories about the nature of this strange and horrifying accident. Overlooked amid much of the hysteria is the fact that Lipsky's death is part of a larger phenomena, and the phenomena did not stop with Lipsky. A few years after Yuri Lipsky's death received international attention, a 24-year-old diver from England named James Smith went missing at the Blue Hole. The story initially followed what seemed to be emerging as a pattern. He entered the water, and somewhere between there and the opening 250 meters away, he simply vanished. However, one thing that makes Smith's death particularly haunting is that despite the fact he was known to die in a very specific location, namely the Blue Hole, his body has never been found. The rest of us can only assume he's still buried somewhere deep beneath the surface of the Red Sea, swallowed forever by the alluring spirit of Shaheen. Visitors to the Blue Hole today will see James Smith's name alongside many others. But there's another name that might make you do a double take. Karl Marx. It's not the author of the Communist Manifesto. It is, in fact, a 45-year-old German diver who had a fatal accident on January 10, 2007 at the Blue Hole of Dahab. A year after Marx, Swiss diver Stefan Felder suffered a similar fate, descending confidently and peacefully into the calm coastal waters of the Red Sea. Then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, he was nowhere to be found. In recent years, the deaths have not shown any signs of stopping either. In fact, in 2017, international interest was reignited in the remote diving site after a dramatic incident involving multiple pro divers. World record-setting freediver Alicia Zecchini traveled to the Blue Hole in July of 2017. Not only was Zecchini planning to dive at the deadly site, but she would in fact be attempting something that perhaps no person had ever attempted before. She would be trying to cross the Blue Hole's famous archway with just a single breath. Accompanying Zecchini was Irish safety diver Stephen Keenan. Keenan was described by Outsider magazine as, quote, "freediving's most accomplished and beloved safety diver." Surely, if anyone could pass through the deadly Blue Hole and live to tell the tale, it would be the sport's most accomplished and beloved safety diver, right? At about 160 feet below the surface, Alicia Zecchini became disoriented. Automatically, Keenan dove down to meet her. As he swam towards the surface carrying Zecchini, Zecchini was eventually able to regain her bearings and swim to safety. But when she got there, Keenan was nowhere to be found. It was later determined that Keenan had blacked out. It is unknown to this day the depth at which Keenan lost consciousness. He was found floating on the surface nearby, face down, motionless. Keenan's death sent shockwaves through the international diving community, providing even more evidence that the forces at work in Dahab were truly something above and beyond the ordinary in an already extraordinary sport. Alright, we've now looked at just 9 of the potentially 200+ fatal accidents that have occurred at the Blue Hole. Frankly, most of what we learn from these stories is that whatever forces are at work, they're swift and they're powerful. Divers seem to just disappear in the blink of an eye. Seasoned professionals seem to suddenly lose their grasp of the situation, descending inexplicably, almost as if they're doing it on purpose. As bizarre as the whole thing is, thanks to an international community of diving experts and a growing interest in the site over previous decades, some plausible explanations do exist. We'll go through these one by one, starting with the phenomena known as narcosis. In underwater diving, one of the most important factors for divers to always consider is the inherent risk of breathing out of a gas tank at extreme depth. According to the NIH, quote, "Certain gases at high pressure cause an anesthetic effect that alters a diver's consciousness." This strange condition has also been nicknamed the raptures of the deep. It has even been called the martini effect for the drunken state it seems to put unsuspecting divers in. The mechanics of it are still not completely understood by science, but in short, certain gases with higher lipophilicity cause mental impairment as underwater depth increases. These effects can be felt starting at depths below around 30 feet, and they're usually mild. But once you start descending to extreme depths of several hundred feet or more, the symptoms are downright shocking. Divers breathing at a depth of below 300 feet can experience powerful hallucinations. They can also lose their sense of both time and direction while experiencing dramatic changes in mood, including becoming manic or euphoric. In extreme cases, narcosis itself can even kill you. Divers in the Blue Hole are potentially encountering depths of 400 feet below the surface, meaning they are way beyond even the far threshold for severe narcosis. The connection here between the science and the mythology is hard to ignore. Upon reaching the glowing blue archway, divers may suddenly be overcome by an eerie change in both body and mind. This change is, by all accounts, something like being really drunk, really confused, and suddenly enthusiastic and impulsive. Could this be the sinister lore of the ancient spirit of Shaheen? As chilling as it is to consider, it is quite possible that many of the divers who met their demise here met it by the propulsion of their own flippers. Just ask Sylvie Martin. An experienced diver in her own right, Martin was diving the Blue Hole when, according to her own first-hand account, she began feeling off. At about 200 feet below the surface, she actually began intentionally deflating her buoyancy regulator. Her dive buddy had to swim down, grab her, and pull her up toward the surface before she suddenly came to her senses again. If narcosis can induce borderline suicidal behavior in experienced divers, what can it do to inexperienced divers? The simple reality of the Blue Hole is that it is really, really deep. Much deeper than many diving enthusiasts will ever go in their lifetime. Depth does incredibly dangerous things to your mind. But that's not all that depth does. Another deadly obstacle imposed by the Blue Hole's extreme depth is the sheer challenge of breathing itself. Not only do you run the risk of crazy hallucinations and deranged behavior thanks to narcosis, but you also run the risk of simply running out of air. The reason for this is simple, but easy to overlook or underestimate. The further you descend underwater, and the more water pressure increases, the more oxygen you need. This need increases at an alarmingly fast rate. Atmospheric pressure doubles every 10 meters. So, roughly speaking, every 10 meters you descend, your body requires double the amount of oxygen. When you are hundreds of feet below the surface, the amount of air you need to breathe is many, many times more than what you would normally need on land. Bringing enough air to make it all the way through the depths of the blue hole is a genuine logistical challenge. Even if you bring all the necessary equipment with you, which will surely include several tanks with different gas mixes which you can easily cycle through, you can't hang out down there for long. On the other hand, if you don't bring enough air in the first place, you're obviously in big trouble from the moment you start the dive. To be so catastrophically underprepared would seem like a rookie mistake, but there is ample reason to think that even experienced divers can seriously miscalculate at this particular site. For example, Yuri Lipsky, a diving instructor, reportedly entered the blue hole with only one tank strapped to his back. Even those who are familiar with the fact you need more oxygen for lower depths can still underestimate just how much they need for depths as extreme as this. So in short, we can add unexpectedly running out of air to the list of possible explanations, in addition to losing your mental faculties due to narcosis. But there's still more going on here. It's hard enough already to navigate an underwater dive site with a narcosis-drunken brain and no air in your lungs. But try doing it while also being so deep underwater that you can't even figure out which direction is the surface and which direction is the bottom of the ocean. Now, this sounds almost impossible because it's so far removed from our intuitions about the physical world, but in such a foreign, extreme environment, basic senses we normally rely on start to break down. According to the National Ocean Service, it is rare that sunlight ever reaches further than 200 meters below the surface of the ocean. Divers in the blue hole are potentially swimming well over halfway toward the point where their surroundings would become as black as empty outer space, where photosynthesis is impossible, and where, soon enough, David Attenborough would start pointing out shrimp that glow in the dark and fish with light bulbs dangling in front of their faces. Divers in the blue hole never quite reach this point of total blackness, but keep in mind, they are also wearing masks and heavy diving equipment, and they are swimming through dramatic underwater landscapes that block out what little light there is even further. The ominously intriguing blue glow of the archway is made so in large part by the fact that it dominates the spectrum of visible light at that depth. Now, divers will inevitably carry flashlights, but while these are lifesavers when it comes to one's immediate surroundings, they don't provide much help when it comes to the larger picture. Floating through deep, open waters with little to no ability to see the surface means you might decide it's time to bail, and yet realize with shock that you don't know which way to go. This, too, might explain why so many divers who enter the blue hole fail to resurface. There is one last factor worth considering when it comes to the blue hole, or rather, the Red Sea in general. The Red Sea is a unique body of water for two reasons. One, it is home to an unusually vast array of marine life, both fish and plant, many of which can only be found there and nowhere else. And two, it is largely unexplored. Couple this with the fact that many of the blue hole's victims, including even some of the ones we looked at today, have never been found, and it does paint an interesting picture. Of course, let's be clear, this is highly speculative, but it does seem possible, given the amount of unique marine life and how little we still know about what lies beneath the Red Sea, that chance encounters with hostile organisms could perhaps explain some of these disappearances too. After all, where else are unsuspecting divers plunging freely into extreme depths of this particular body of water on a regular basis? The Red Sea has plenty of other popular diving sites, but none so extreme, so deep, so full of shadows. There is something distinctly human about underwater diving. It represents one of our most innate traits in its purest form, the primal impulse to venture into the unknown. It is hard to imagine a world more alien than the world awaiting those who swim the blue hole of Dahab, and yet it sits freely accessible just meters away from the bars and beach towels that line the South Egyptian shore. But this alien world also inflicts strange, rapid infirmities upon our land-dwelling human bodies. It sucks the air from our lungs, even when we thought we brought enough air with us. It confounds our special awareness, temporarily erasing physical realities as fundamental as the sky above and the ground below. Perhaps most frightening of all, it corrupts our minds, making us think and do things that only moments ago we would have never imagined. Contrary to what many might believe, however, safely diving the blue hole of Dahab is, in fact, possible. Highly experienced, technically proficient divers can and do take all the necessary precautions and swim through this marvelous natural wonder on a regular basis. But sadly, even to this day, they constitute a mere percentage of the total number of divers who make the voyage out to this mystical and remote site. Until the international diving community wakes up to the truly incredible risks associated with the blue hole and begins heeding the warnings and advice of local experts like Tarek Omar, the blue hole of Dahab will continue to cast its alluring spell over unsuspecting divers, reeling them in with its magical glow, then snatching them out of existence before anyone has time to save them. California beachgoers are no strangers to the hundreds of small caves dotting the rocky coastlines all along the state's oceanic border. Some marvel at the foreboding tunnels from afar, others take their boats inside for picnics and parties, and some dare to dive into the waters and explore the caves on foot. Many of these caves may be small, but make no mistake, these unforgiving caves can kill just as easily as the world's largest subterranean mazes. One traveler learned firsthand how deadly these caves can be when he found himself injured and trapped inside Terranea Cove. This is the story of his struggle for survival and the lone lifeguard who risked it all to save him. The cave of today's video goes by a few different names. Some call it Hudson's Bluff, while others call it Terranea Cove. Either way, it's a sea cave formed by waters crashing into weak sections of the rocky coastline. Sometimes the oceanic salt water dissolves the coast and pushes sea caves deeper, connecting them to inland caves if their tunnels reach too close to the coastline. Otherwise known as littoral caves, sea caves are usually much smaller than their inland counterparts, but occasionally, fault lines can enable sea caves to grow to the size of regular caves. Nearby examples include the Catacombs Cave and the Convergent Fault Cave at California's Anacapa Island, formed by 6 fault lines converging with a weak section of coastline, enabling the sea to flood into the cracks and form a massive cave. Quietly hidden along the coastline at the Rancho Palos Verdes, Terranea Cove might not be interesting to geologists, but it is one of the most famous coastal caves on the planet. Film crews turned the cave into a vampire lair for the 1987 movie The Lost Boys. The film was commercially and critically successful, grossing $32.2 million with a production budget of only $8.5 million. The success of The Lost Boys is nothing compared to the blockbusters of today, but the movie single-handedly changed how vampires were portrayed in media, paving the way for cultural hits like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Twilight. One day, a traveler visiting the California coast decided to enter the Lost Boys Cave. Because sea caves are so small and generally easy to explore, he didn't think to bring any special gear. After all, there's no danger of falling into a crack, and the cave doesn't encourage kneeling or belly crawling through tight squeezes like regular caves. Instead, the bottoms of the sea caves like this one are often accessible from the beach, or they might be permanently flooded, so explorers can bring kayaks or other boats into the rocky alcove. It was his first time visiting the Palos Verdes sea caves. He saw social media posts that made the area look like a ton of fun. Some videos show that this cave isn't always flooded, so this adventurer didn't even bring a swimsuit. He had the day to himself. And while it would have been more fun with friends, he wasn't going to let their plans ruin his good time, so he went to the beach alone. From the Pelican Cove parking lot, the novice caver went on a short hike along the Point Vincente Trail to the South Bay. The gnarled yellow rock of the coastline met a gray, pebbled beach as cool ocean tides lapped up to the shore. Tide pools teeming with marine life dotted the walkway, and in the distance, the Point Vincente lighthouse kept its watchful gaze over the ocean to warn wandering ships of the rocky coast ahead. This route is great for casual hikers and visitors to the region. Park officials placed restrooms and showers beyond the tide pools, and there's even a nearby restaurant to replenish your energy after a long day of adventuring in California's sea caves and coastlines. However, the allure of alcohol can get the best of people. Many people have downed a couple beers to get a nice buzz going before running back to the Pacific waters nearby. Slips and falls are common. Now, many just get scraped or bruised, but the occasional sprain or concussion can happen, especially when drunk partygoers take to the caves at nighttime. And that's when our man saw the cave. There are multiple paths to reach Terranea. The easiest route is along the beach when the tide is low, but some cavers must climb the waterlogged rocks and around the ledge to reach it. Or swimmers may try the route by water. While the cave is an idyllic spot for a selfie, all paths have their perils. The rocks are slippery and jagged. It only takes one strong wave to knock you back. Since this cave is often explored by hikers and visitors, almost no one brings helmets or other protective gear. Even a small fall on these rocks could be lights out permanently. Inside Terranea Cove, Hudson's Bluff Sea Cave explorers can gaze out at the vast horizon and endless blue skies. Except the normally pristine skyline was blemished that day. Dark gray clouds loomed overhead. They were fast approaching and swallowing the sky as they charged toward the coastline. The man stripped off his shirt and shoes and jumped into the water. He swam to the edge of the cave and climbed onto the rocky floor. There, he sat, listening to the unique symphony played by the water echoing through the holes of the rocky cliffs. Mesmerized by the sound, time escaped him. After splashing in the sea some more, he left to go get some food. He later came back to the cliff for one last jump. He walked to the edge and looked over. By now, the tides had completely covered the floor of the cave, but he couldn't see how deep they were. The waves were getting stronger, but nothing that he couldn't handle. Or so he thought. He stepped back a few feet, the stones and rough terrain stabbing at his bare feet as he braced himself, pushed off with his back leg, and ran to the edge. He jumped, his arms waving through the air to balance himself. He had just enough space to avoid the rocks below. With a splash, the sound around him muffled as the water closed around him. He sank down a few feet or so before his downward momentum slowed to a stop. He kicked his feet and dug through the water with his hands as his cheeks ballooned with the last gulp of held breath. The darkening sky cast only thin rays of light through the frantic waters as he crested above and gasped for air. He shook his head and opened his eyes just in time to see terror approaching. A massive wave crashed into him, pulling him below the waterline again. Without time for a good breath, his mouth filled with salt water as roiling sprays stung his eyes. The force of the wave pushed him inside Terranea Cave. He desperately grasped at the rocks, trying to right himself and keep his head above water. The cove of the cave broke the waves, giving him just enough respite to climb the rocky walls to higher ground. A group back at the restaurant noticed that he jumped again, but he never came back up the cliff. Concerned, they braced for the winds whipping across the bay and walked to the cliff. They could hear him shouting for help below. Inebriated and shocked, the group stood at the coast and waved at the sky, begging for help, instead of returning to the bar to call for aid. All the while, the waves rose higher and higher. Meanwhile, on the sandy beaches down the coastline, Nick Mako was using his binoculars to scan the beach. Mako was a veteran of the Los Angeles County Fire Department's lifeguard division with 20 years of heroic work on his resume. Instead of the old days, or what you might see in the movies, Mako often sits in an off-road truck or SUV while on duty. Vehicles like his are mobile command centers for the lifeguards. Instead of dotting the coastline with dozens of sheds and tall lifeguard seats, rescuers can store all their first aid gear in the trunk and quickly drive from point A to B whenever or wherever they're needed. Mako turned the volume down on his speakers as he awaited for word from his relief. He was eager to get home and relax after a tense day on duty, but the ominous sky worried him. The winds had picked up speed and the tide was getting aggressive. Beachgoers were already thinning out, and this was at the height of the pandemic, so the crowds were already pretty thin, but he didn't take anything for granted. He performed one last scan of the horizon before his backup was scheduled to arrive. With only 2 minutes left on his shift, Mako heard something over the sound of his music. His cell phone. It wasn't his family or friends asking him to get drinks later. The screen on his phone read, 911 dispatch. Mako quickly answered the call. The calm, almost robotic voice of the operator informed him that fishermen were returning to the docks to beat the storm when they saw what looked like a group of people waving their arms. The fishermen approached and saw the group of panicked vacationers yelling for help on the coastline, and the fishermen were the ones to call in the emergency. They also said a puzzling line. The stuck caver was running out of air. Mako forgot all about his shift ending and his weekend plans and jumped into action. He gathered his gear and turned on his vehicle, but before he could hit the gas, he realized a glaring problem. There were tons of caves along the Palos Verdes coastline. If he checked them one by one, he could easily run out of time to save whoever was stuck, and each time he checked, he would be putting himself in harm's way. The line about air caused Mako to wonder if the caver was a diver. If he was, Mako wouldn't be able to do much on his own, especially with the rising tides. That was it. The rising tides. The cave had to be in the Lost Boys Cave because it has a secondary tunnel past the main entrance. If the trapped explorer went deeper into the cave to avoid the waters, he would be trapped, as the waterline turned into a sump that sealed off his exit. The waters would rise slowly in the inner chamber, giving him time to panic and yell for help. Mako called for backup and informed them the trapped caver could be anywhere, but he trusted his instincts and drove to the cave. Back inside the cave, the stranded thrill-seeker was paralyzed with fear. He could try to climb across the ledge and climb up the cliff, but he couldn't shake the paranoia of what might happen. When the tides threw him back, he collided with a large rock in the center of the channel leading into the cave. He was bloody from the impact. His pain and the endless waves made him think about slipping into the rocks. Even if he didn't fall into the ocean, he could still die on that ledge if he hit his head. After all, it's possible to drown in only an inch of water. It just takes enough water to cover your mouth and nose. And with the surging tides frothing higher and higher, there was more than enough water to drown him if he lost consciousness. Waves like the one crashing into the cave move at an average speed of roughly 6 miles per hour, which doesn't sound like much, but these aren't wind. Even small waves can apply hundreds of pounds of pressure. But even the force of these waves is usually not enough to cause any damage. Even infants can take the full brunt of some small waves. Almost everyone stood on the beach and tried to remain standing as the waves come crashing in. However, with the ground to stand on, your body will move with the waves. It isn't how much force the waves hit you with, but how they hit you. With your back against the rocks, the impact of the wave would have little effect. But even if your back is against the rocky shore, the movement of the tide can pull you forward. Then, the sudden shift in direction can send you whipping back into the rock. The man's fear was reasonable. It's not the force of the blow that causes concussions, but the velocity of the brain hitting the inside of your skull. People can shrug off a strong blow that doesn't move the skull very much, but even a light tap to the side of the jaw can twist the skull with enough torque to whip your brain into your skull and shut off your frontal lobes. The man's frantic thoughts were suddenly cut off by the sound of a voice. Mako had made it to the cliff above him. The two shouted to each other over the roar of the waves while additional rescuers arrived at the scene. With multiple people to help, they could easily toss a ladder down or work in tandem to save him. Normally, when rescuers save people from caves, they create a long chain of people from the accident site all the way to the entrance. That way, there's always someone in touch with the trapped or injured caver. The human chain prevents any one rescuer from fatiguing on the exit route, and all the eyes can watch for any additional dangers. But the rescuers realized a traditional rescue wouldn't work here. The first responders were mostly fellow firefighters, paramedics, and police who weren't trained to handle open water rescues, especially in the raging tides. Fellow lifeguards arrived to help, but they weren't trained in cave rescues. Mako realized he was the only one there trained for this rare scenario. Mako squeezed into his wetsuit, strapped on his helmet, grabbed a long red life preserver, and jumped into the rising waters. He kept to the side of the cave to avoid gathering momentum if the water pushed him into the walls. Video from the rescue shows the tides look almost calm as Mako swims into Terranea Cove, but remember, this cave was dry just hours before. Plus, inside the stone walls of Hudson's Bluff, the waters were completely different. The swelling waves crashed along the walls of the cave and the currents bashed into each other, creating a whirlpool. Mako said it was like being stuck in a washing machine. Mako reached the injured caver and assessed his situation. The man was shocked, but then hope came to his face as Mako reassured him. But that confidence instantly drained when Mako told him to grab onto the life preserver and hold on tight. He was confused and asked, "Shouldn't they wait for the rest of the rescuers?" Mako grimly informed him that he was the only one who could save him now. The man resisted. He felt abandoned as his life flashed before his eyes. Mako reminded him that they could still make it out alive, but time was running out. If they didn't leave now, they would both drown. The man hesitated, but he grabbed hold of the flotation device and Mako began swimming for both of their lives. The waters became almost impassable as Mako defiantly kicked and pulled through the waves. Mako used every muscle in his body to push forward, but at some moments he actually lost ground as the waves forced him backward. Footage from the return trip shows 1 to 3 foot waves threatening to kill the two men. Thankfully, the moment they left the mouth of the cave, the tides lowered just enough for Mako to torpedo his way across the last stretch of water. They reached the edge of the rocky coast at a spot with enough hand and footholds to safely climb up. Mako had to help the man up, but he lost his footing and nearly crashed into the rocks. He heaved once more and brought the man up to what looked like safety, but just as they stood up, they saw how close they came to death. The moment they turned around, a wave much larger and more aggressive than the ones they battled with before slammed into the rock at the exact spot they used to climb out of the water. If they had been only seconds later, the wave could have knocked the man off the life preserver and sent him rolling down into the cave. Mako himself could have been thrown from the ledge and dashed against the rocks, where he would have been left concussed or bleeding as the water shoved him into Terranea as well. But somehow, they made it out alive. The two climbed up the coastline and the man was treated for his injuries. He apologized for his disbelief and distrust of Mako's abilities and thanked him for risking his life to save him. Likewise, the humble lifeguard thanked his chief and the supporting rescuers for their willingness to jump into the raging California waters despite the dangers. In 2020, at the International Surf Festival, Mako was awarded the Medal of Valor for his daring rescue at the Terranea Cove cave. Have you ever visited a film location somewhere in nature? Did your trip go well? Or was it as disastrous as our unlucky adventurer? Tell us your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, click that like button and subscribe to the channel for more hair-raising stories of life and death.